Welcome to Haunting Whispers. Tonight, as the rain falls softly, we'll share some true scary stories to help you relax and fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world and the time you are listening. This video also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story. The door said, "Do not open." I opened it. Big mistake. It happened on July 5th. I'll never forget that day, nor the hangover that came with it. My eyes were swollen, glistening red. My head felt like a Metallica concert. Why did I stay out so late? Truth be told, it wasn't my fault. It was Rowan's fault. She's my girlfriend. She wanted to party. Don't judge her. Unlike me, Rowan is very smart. She studied biology. My boss, who's also my uncle, made me work that morning so he could have the entire weekend off. Needless to say, I partied my face off the night before. It was Independence Day, for Christ's sake. What did he expect? Uncle Ray owns Brews and Wash, a laundromat which serves alcohol. It's located in the old part of town, where the buildings are ramshackle and derelict. The clientele is, well, suspect at best. But for the most part, they don't bother me much. First off, I'd never been in the basement before. It's off limits. Plus, I've never opened the store. That's Ray's job. But he gave me the keys and told me not to do anything stupid. Now don't get me wrong, it's an easy job. Even an idiot like me can do it. Still, it would have been nice if Ray had warned me about the door. The basement is where Ray keeps the beer. Judging from the empty fridge, we'd sold a ton of beer the day before. Like, who does laundry on the 4th? First thing I had to do was stock up the beer fridge, so I went downstairs to the basement. It's a good thing I'm short, or dare I say, vertically challenged. I had to crouch. The basement has a low ceiling, the walls are dry-laid stone. It smelled like piss and mouse droppings, cobwebs covering every inch of the mossy walls. I hate old basements. There was only one light bulb, dangling vicariously at the bottom of the stairs. Probably not safe. At the bottom of the stairs was a stack of empties with fruit flies zooming in and out of soggy cardboard boxes. As I searched the basement, looking for the beer, something scurried across my foot, causing me to jump and smash my head on the low-lying ceiling. It hurt like hell, let me tell you. The sooner I found the beer, the better. Already, the basement was giving me the heebie-jeebies. I turned on my phone's flashlight and scanned the tight quarters. Mostly the basement was filled with junk, soap boxes galore. Several cases of beer were stacked against the furthest wall to my right, next to the broken mop bucket. I shoved my phone into my pocket and grabbed a case. Then I scooted back towards the stairs, careful not to trip on anything. I stopped. There was a peculiar door hidden behind the stairs, roughly 4 feet tall and covered in filth. Around the handle was a derelict sign declaring "Do not enter." In the middle of the door, behind a curtain of cobwebs, was a human skull. It was painted, probably red, but it's hard to tell. It was severely faded, ravaged from time. Just looking at it creeped me out. But the door held me prisoner. I couldn't keep my eyes off it. Attached was a sizable silver lock. Without knowing it, I was fumbling the key ring and discovered a bizarre key shaped like a human skull. It looked extremely old as the building at least. I'll bet that weird-looking key fits that lock. For a moment I stood stupidly, grappling with the key ring while balancing the beer, wondering about the "Do not enter" sign. Bzzz. Something buzzed, startling me. I sprang upstairs like a scared kid in a cheesy horror story. Stupid phone. Rowan texted me asking how I was feeling. Deeply embarrassed, I replied with a thumbs up and a series of hearts. I'll send a proper message once I finish prepping the store. It was nearing 9 o'clock, opening time. No more dilly-dallying. Before putting my phone away, I texted Ray, asking about the strange door. Not surprisingly, Ray ignored my text. Probably still sleeping. Ray can be a jerk when he wants to be, let's just say. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get this shift over with so I could curl up next to Rowan and snuggle. Fighting a sore head, I stocked the fridge, prepared the till, and did the paperwork. Ray is old. He still prefers paper over computers. Says it's safer that way. Whatever, at least I'm getting paid extra for being here, I reminded myself. I could use the money. I made myself a coffee, then switched the sign to open, wondering who does laundry at this godforsaken hour. On this day, no less. 3 cups of coffee and 2 restroom breaks later, I started getting antsy. My mind kept returning to the door with the "Do Not Enter" sign. Since there were no customers, I could dash downstairs, open the door, and have a peek. I pondered this for the better part of an hour. Still, no customers. The key ring danced between my fingers, beckoning me, until finally I submitted. Just a quick peek, I reminded myself. If only I resisted. If only customers came. If only. The stairs protested under my weight, creaking as I crept. The light from my phone made strange shadows which skittered across the stone walls like cockroaches. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, my heart suddenly stopped. The door was shimmering. The skull seemed alive, its empty eyes sizing me up. I fumbled the keys, dropping them. When I scooped them up, they were sticky and gross from the gooey floor, which probably hadn't been cleaned in 100 years. The skull was taunting me, daring me to enter. It was pulsating, breathing perhaps. I knew this was impossible, that the darkness was hampering my better judgment, so I laughed, teasing myself. But damn, was I jittery. Go on, I told myself. Can't chicken out now. Just a peek. Maybe I'll discover long-lost treasures. Classic baseball cards, perhaps. How cool is that? I wiped my sweaty brow, which made my face dirty. Every inch of the basement was filthy. Ugh, it's now or never, I told myself, so before I could chicken out, I jammed the strange key into the silver lock. It clicked. The door swung over. Thick fog wafted into the basement, which had a distinct smell like rotten eggs. I gagged. Cautiously, crouched as low as possible, I poked my head inside the door. Just one peek, I reminded myself. It was pitch dark, icy cold. Laggardly, I passed through the door. My heart was racing, sweat stinging my eyes. I snatched my phone and turned on the light. All I saw was fog. Disappointed, I shook my head, cursing my stupidity. Careful not to smash my head, I crept back upstairs, both relieved and disappointed. Halfway upstairs, the door dinged. A customer. It was Maybelle, an elderly lady who does her laundry once a month. She's nice enough. I watched her load the machines, then sit by the big bay window and start reading a paperback. She lives across the street in an apartment complex. Once, when I asked her why she doesn't use their facilities, she told me she liked getting out once in a while. Besides, she doesn't trust their machines. Panicking, I realized I hadn't shut the basement door. Who knows what could crawl out of that tiny crevice? Cursing my existence and nursing a headache, I inched downstairs. Then I stopped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Snow. It rarely snows in my town, even in the winter. But in July, in a basement, this made zero sense. The snow was wafting in from the half-open door. My trembling hands found the key ring, while my eyes stared in bewilderment. I'd better shut the damn door before the entire basement fills with snow. I took one small step and slipped, smashing my head against the stairs. My entire body protested, especially my head, which already hurt. Shivering and sore all over, I crawled towards the door, complaining the entire time, and slammed it shut. Whoosh. Immediately, the snowstorm ceased. When I shoved the key into the lock, however, nothing happened. The door wouldn't lock, no matter how hard I tried. Again, I cursed myself. What on God's green earth have I gotten myself into? That's when I noticed the skull. It was grinning. For a moment, I stared, mesmerized. It's not every day you find a skull-clad door grinning back at you with a "Do Not Enter" sign. When I jammed the key into the lock, this ought to do it. The door spatted out. Not to be deterred, I dropped to my knees, grateful I'd worn jeans, and searched through the fresh layer of snow. But I couldn't find the key. I went for my phone, and I dropped it too. Frustration was getting the best of me. Losing a key was one thing. My phone, on the other hand, bewildered, I swept my hands across the icy floor until I found my phone, which was lying on top of the key. I grabbed both, then bolted upstairs. I could care less about locking the stupid door. Whatever was down there was Ray's responsibility, not mine. Standing behind the counter, pretending to be busy, I fidgeted with my phone, hoping it was okay. It wasn't. None of the apps seemed to work. Great, like I needed this. I did nothing for an hour except pout, while Maybelle neatly folded her laundry. Moments after she left, a middle-aged man entered, asking about the beer prices. When I responded, he left, shaking his head, grumbling. As soon as the place emptied, I started shivering. It was getting colder by the minute. Automatically, I reached for my phone and tried texting Ray again. Of course, my phone wouldn't work. Worse, my screensaver was now a skull. Same skull as on the door. It was laughing at me. Anger fueled my next decision. I may not be the most intimidating guy, but I'm far from wimpy. I work out regularly and play baseball on the weekends. I can handle myself. Thank you very much. Time to teach whatever is down there a lesson. Sometimes courage comes at the worst time. I marched downstairs, keys in hand. To my surprise, the door had reopened. The basement was completely covered in snow. 2 inches at least. Shivering, I slammed the door shut, stuffed the key into the lock, and turned. Nothing. Heavy winds howled. The door belched a blustery storm which blew right through me, sliding me to the other end of the basement. Shocked and horrified, I dragged myself along the icy floor until I reached the door. I swear the skull was mocking my miserable existence. My body wouldn't stop shaking. The sooner I'm out of here, the better. I decided right then and there I was going to march upstairs and close shop. Screw Ray. Besides, he'd be saving money, seeing as how the place was dead. The door dinged. Ugh, I'd better get back upstairs. It was rough going, let me tell you. The stairs were small and slippery. I clenched the rickety handrail with all my might, careful not to smash my head, or worse, fall head over heels backwards. When I returned behind the counter, I was shocked to see my girlfriend standing there, arms crossed. Her eyes were confrontational. I didn't dare speak. We had a stare-off, one I was destined to lose. My phone died, I finally said, breaking the silence. She smiled beautifully, but still, she regarded me with suspicion. Then I remembered my face was filthy, and I was a shivering mess. "What is it?" she asked, clearly concerned. I couldn't lie to her, nor could I outsmart her, so I flat out told her. "Want to see something strange?" She looked at me with skepticism, but nodded yes. Hand in dirty hand, we descended into the basement. "This makes 0 sense," she said, matter-of-factly. Part of her face showed fear, but there was something else as well. Curiosity. By now, the basement was a junk-filled hockey rink. I pointed to the door, and she gasped. She let go of my hand and glided towards the door, ducking under the stairs. "Let's go in," she said, her eyes big and brown. Resistance was futile. She was always braver than me, one of the things I loved about her. "It's too cold," I said through chattering teeth. Then I remembered something. "Wait here." I scooted upstairs to the lost and found bin and rummaged through it until I found a pair of coats. "Take this," I said, offering her a coat. Before I knew it, Rowan was leading me through the eerie door. "I don't believe it," she gasped. "What is this place?" We walked, head down, until we came to a clearing. It was a winter wonderland, a palace made of snow. It was too dark to see much, so we crept forward cautiously. My knees wobbled, my heart near explosion. I hated Rowan at this moment, or perhaps I hated her bravado. Something didn't feel right about this place. I knew this was a bad idea. "This is amazing," she said, seemingly unaffected by the wintry weather. I, on the other hand, was freezing to death. The coat helped, but barely. Something screamed. We halted, scanning the vicinity, seeing nothing but white. More screaming, like a million souls crying at once. "We're in a torture chamber," she declared. I was going to rebut when the ground below us started cracking. The ice moaned. Oh no, I thought. We're going to fall through. Violently, the ground jerked. I slipped and fell backwards, my hand leaving hers. She reached out, trying to save me, our fingers narrowly touching, but I ended up in a plot of snow. Then the unthinkable happened. The ground opened up and swallowed her whole. "Row!" I cried, watching her fall through the ice. Just before she disappeared, her eyes found mine. In them I saw love. Then she was gone. I called out for her again and again, weeping. Tears froze on my ashen face. The weather was worsening, the torrent of screams more severe. Crack. Belly first, I dragged myself towards the hole in the ice, holding on for dear life. The ground around me was swelling. One more crack and I'm a goner. I reached the gap, looked down, and shuddered. Rowan was right. It was a torture chamber. Beasts with thick mangy fur and sword-like claws were tearing people apart, limb by limb. Blood and snow and fur collided. Mounds of bodies lay frozen, caked in crimson blood, moaning and crying. My mind couldn't comprehend what it was seeing. There must have been millions of souls down there, all suffering. Carefully, I crawled backwards toward the door, fearful it would close and I'd be trapped. My hands were blue from frostbite. The door seemed impossibly far. I didn't think we'd walk this far. The ground crunched as I crawled. A speck of light found me, and I yelped. I was crawling on the bones of the dead. Another scream. This one I recognized. "Jackson!" Get out while you can. Well? My meager voice fell flat. Her words terrified me, made worse by the fact that she's the best part of my life. I couldn't just leave her. The whirling winds told me otherwise. My face was being pelted with ice pellets. I had to escape. Finally, I reached the door and loped through it, slamming it shut. I jammed the key into the hole, and this time it clicked. Swoop. My heart was heavy. I needed to help my girlfriend before it was too late. Deep down, I knew it was already too late, but I refused to believe it. First thing I did was close the laundromat. After checking my phone, still not working, I dragged myself to the police station. I hated doing so, but I had to save Rowan. I told them everything. The dispatcher laughed and twirled her hair, chewing her bubblegum. After an hour of waiting, an officer greeted me. He was old, near retirement, and looked crabby. I led him to the laundromat and showed him the door. By now the snow had melted, but the floor was sticky and wet. He told me to open it. I took a deep breath, then I stuck the key inside the door with the "Do Not Enter" sign. The key snapped. Ah, crap. The cop snarled. I shrugged, trying to ignore the prying eyes of the human skull, pestering me. The officer was having none of it. Eventually, after questioning me again and again, he contacted Rowan's parents, who were distraught. Then he contacted Ray, who was livid. Fast forward a few months. Ultimately, I was relieved of any charges, for the time being at least. Rowan never turned up. Foul play, they declared, me being the #1 suspect. Ray, whose surveillance cameras were non-functional, fired me. We haven't spoken since. Everyone in town looks at me funny, no doubt. They think I'm a murderer, missing Rowan more each day. I've decided to get my life straightened out, whatever that means. Yesterday, while on my way to school, I've been accepted into a community college. I was stopped by the same cop who questioned me earlier this summer. He was plain-clothed and looked fatally exhausted. "I'm retired," he said. "Follow me." To my surprise, he led me into a donut shop, ordered coffees and crullers, then sprung something remarkable on me. "I believe you found it," he said flatly. "The doorway to hell." I spit out my coffee, soaking him. "Hell is cold, not hot," he said, not bothering to wipe the coffee stains from his khaki shirt. "And I've spent most of my life searching for it." He asked me to describe it with detail. I tried, but instead I started weeping. I'd finally gotten over the grief. "Now this?" He reached into his pocket, produced a small black box, and opened it. What I saw made my skin crawl. A key. It was large and silver. At its tip was a skull. The skull was grinning. "Let's go save your girlfriend, shall we?" That was just the beginning. The next story is even more chilling. Don't turn off the lights. My child isn't alone. This happened back when I was in 9th grade, about 6 years ago. I had a best friend, let's call her Ashley. She didn't have the easiest life growing up, and things around her always felt off. She lived in Wisconsin, and when she was just 8, her house caught fire. She made it out with her dad and brother, but tragically, her mom and 2 younger sisters didn't survive. Ashley always talked about feeling like something was following her. It wasn't just a vague feeling either. Late at night, when I'd be on the phone with her, I'd hear her scream suddenly, followed by a loud thud. Then, she'd come to school the next day with these bright red handprints on her ankle, like something yanked her off her bed in the middle of the night. At first, I thought maybe it was her dad or brother, but after spending weeks at her house, I ruled that out. They were either too out of it or too lazy to even get off the couch. Whatever was happening to her wasn't coming from them. Weird things happened every time I stayed over. I'd go to the kitchen for water late at night, turn off the light, walk halfway down the hall, and suddenly the light would flick back on. Every time I'd spin around, no one was there. The only switch was at the edge of the kitchen, and there was no way anyone could have flicked it on without me seeing them. Then one night, things got really messed up. Ashley, our friend Eli, and I were hanging out at Eli's place. Ashley had fallen asleep, her head in my lap, while Eli and I watched TV. Everything seemed normal until about an hour into her sleep. She started to feel cold. Really cold. I covered her with a blanket, but it didn't help. Then, without warning, she shot up, gasping for air like she had been drowning. She stood up and walked out of the room without saying a word. Eli and I were confused, but didn't think too much of it at first. A minute later, Ashley came back, but she was holding a butcher's knife. She stood at the door just staring at us. I swear her face was blank, like she wasn't even really there. Eli and I started to freak out. Eli asked, "Dude, what do we do? You and her always talk about this stuff. Do we line the door with salt or something?" I was just as panicked. "I don't know. Maybe. Just do it." So Eli grabbed salt and started lining the doorway and windows. But Ashley hadn't moved. She just stood there, staring with that knife in her hand. Then, suddenly, she started chanting. It wasn't English, and it wasn't anything I recognized. Latin, maybe? Or something worse? That's when she turned to the wall and started stabbing it over and over, still chanting in that creepy voice. Eli and I were frozen in place, too shocked to move. Then, just as suddenly as she started, she stopped. She dropped the knife and collapsed to the floor. Eli's brother, Jake, woke up and came out of his room, confused by all the noise. "What the hell is going on?" Eli quickly shouted, "Get back in your room, Jake. Stay back." But Jake didn't listen. He moved toward Ashley, and as soon as he did, she turned and locked eyes with him. He freaked out, ran to the bathroom and slammed the door shut. Ashley followed, scratching at the bathroom door like an animal trying to claw her way inside. The scratching went on for a full 5 minutes before she finally stopped. Then she turned and stared directly at Eli. Her voice cracked as she screamed his name over and over. "Eli! Eli! Eli!" Eli started crying, completely lost. She was 5'2" and barely 110 pounds, but somehow she blew the salt away from the doorway like it was nothing. Then she crawled backwards into the room. She yanked a recliner out of her way with ease, picked up a necklace she had lost a week before, and crawled backwards out of the house. We were in total shock. It was like time stopped. For 30 minutes, we didn't move, didn't say a word. When I finally pulled myself together, I ran out after her. Jake and Eli followed, but we couldn't find her anywhere. We searched for an hour before going back inside, completely confused and scared. It was almost 3 a.m. by then. We tried calling her dad, but no answer. The three of us gathered in Eli's room, too shaken to think straight. At some point, we fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. I woke up first the next morning and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. As I turned the corner, I noticed the front door was wide open, and there, lying asleep on the threshold, was Ashley. I woke her up, and she freaked out, asking how she got there. The last thing she remembered was falling asleep with her head in my lap while we watched TV. She didn't remember anything. Not the chanting, the knife, the scratching, none of it. To this day, I'm not sure if we encountered a demon, a djinn, or something even darker. All I know is that after that night, I didn't spend another night under the same roof as Ashley for a long, long time. One story ends, but another nightmare is waiting. Does sleep paralysis normally get worse? Hey everyone, I'm having maybe a medical emergency and thought I'd use this forum as a way to ask about it. It's a long and strange story, so I'll jump right in. I've had sleep paralysis since I was 12. My mom believes it started as a puberty thing, but it's been 8 years and at least 3 times a week I get locked in my own body, unable to move or talk, only able to breathe and occasionally open my eyes. At first, that was the most of it, just waking up in the night, stuck staring at the ceiling or at a wall, scared but very relieved when it was over. After a year or so, I then began getting the waking nightmares other people get. To start with, it was just noises, indiscernible voices, loud bangs from inside my skull, and the occasional shout from a person not there. A couple months after it began, I would start trying to pry my eyes open. It was hard, but whenever I could manage to open them, I saw bizarre hallucinations. They were always black smears or blobs drifting in and out of view. Sometimes they would stop and just remain still. Whenever that happened, I clenched my eyes shut. There's something haunting about a shapeless entity observing you as you watch it. I know it wasn't real, but the fact it can move and chooses not to scared the shit out of me, even if it was just a blurry circle. I've done my fair share of research on sleep paralysis, and my case is a severe one, but still common enough version of it. The more I looked into it, the more fear I got waiting for the future. A big one I was scared of was hearing footsteps walk right up to you. The idea of that happening to me drove me insane for a while, and then one night when I was 14, it happened. I awake from a nightmare, some bizarre dream about a murderous clown, I think. I was locked in my body as per usual. Then I heard a strange series of noises. First a creaking door, followed by a slam, whisperings that I couldn't comprehend, and then clomp, clomp, clomp. 3 heavy footfalls right beside my bed. The whisperings are partially discernible, but still nonsense. Maybe we should see the monkeys, go to the ground floor. It was driving me mad. Line after line just like that, but instead of all around me, right in front of my face, inches away from me. It had to be real. It had to be some drunken, meth-head freak looming over me, trying to get my attention. He broke the vase. I tried to keep it upright. I fought my eyelids. I forced them open as the bright light of the day made its way through the window into my sensitive eyes, and as they finally cracked open fully. Nothing. Dead silence, and a vague blur hovering just in view. Relief filled my body, but so did dread. Once one new symptom starts, it tends to become commonplace. So from that moment on, every other night, I had to deal with something walking up to me and whispering insanity into my ears. Another symptom I dreaded every time I read about it was the Hat Man. Apparently, nearly every single person who regularly gets sleep paralysis would see a shadowy figure wearing a hat. Noon can definitively say what kind of hat he wears, but they usually lurk just within view. Every time I read that when I was young, I would feel sick. I can handle the blurry shapes even when they stop to look at me, but a full man just waiting for the time to pass in the corner of my eye was sickening. But the truth was, when I finally got that symptom, it was hilarious. The first time it happened, I was 18. I was having another episode where there was something walking up to me. Once again, I pried my eyes open, only this time the voices continued, but they moved rapidly over to where a huge congregation of blobs had formed in the vague shape of a man in the corner of my eye. At first, I wanted to scream. A man was in my room and was whispering nonsense. "Bring out your rake. He's nearly ready." Then I had this overwhelming urge to check his hat. Everyone talks about his hat, so I wanted to finally get to the bottom of what it was. Lo and behold, a fedora. It had to be. The short brim, divot on top, mixed with the vague outline of a trench coat. It was a blurry man trying to look like a detective, or maybe a Redditor. The idea made me snap out of sleep paralysis immediately and laugh my guts up until I cried. This guy, I thought. This guy is the thing everyone is scared of, a rambling idiot in a shitty cosplay. There's only one thing scary about him. Is he real? I know that's a bizarre question, but everyone seems to see him and he is always wearing a hat. So is he real? Or is he a visual ingrained in our minds, an evolutionary fear? If that's the case, why do our minds give him a hat? It's always bothered me a bit. The final symptom I got later was the weight on my chest. Apparently, a lot of people get a heavy hallucinatory feeling on their chest when they're in sleep paralysis. They get a sensation of a little creature resting on them and holding them down. Often this is accompanied by a shortness of breath or the inability to breathe. I never got it until a year ago. At 19, my mom wanted me to move out. She was a very traditional parent. Once you're 18, out of the house, live on your own. I managed to hold on to an extra year, but then my mom buckled down, made us look for some housing. "You're going to be 50 and still living with us, Bailey. Harden up and move out," she would tell me. I always found it insane. She acted like living with a 19-year-old was like looking after a middle-aged man. Besides, she never taught me how to look for a house, get a loan, find places to rent, nothing. I was on my own, working it all out, and she would occasionally shoot me with an address or an affordable place to rent or buy. I would attempt to look into it, but I always got confused or embarrassed while inquiring, so I didn't get far on my own. Mom then received an offer. Mom is a manager at a local grocery store, a small chain, but nothing major. The owner of the whole chain comes in from time to check in with each individual store. Her name is Pauline. She's around 70, and she was so incredibly kind all the time. She always listened to my mom's long-winded, goes-nowhere stories, and even gave her paid leave once when Mom fell ill. Anyway, Pauline came into the store, and my mom went on her usual rambles, but this time she brings up me needing a home. Pauline apparently lit up like crazy and was almost begging my mom to move me into the house neighboring hers. See, Pauline owned nearly her whole street. She bought it out years ago. She rented the houses out for cheap to families in need of easy accommodation and claimed to have even sold a few off well below market value. The house next to Pauline's has been vacant for a while, she told my mom. About 4 years or so is what she said, so she'd happily let me rent it for an insanely cheap amount, just so she was making some kind of money from it. So that's where I moved in. The first day I moved in, I got to meet Pauline myself. She was short but held herself well, white curly hair, and even a small grandma mustache on her upper lip. She helped me tidy the place of dust, which shockingly wasn't much, so I asked her. I thought this place had been empty for a while? Pauline nodded. Yes, a couple months now. Didn't have the time to dust every day, so it built up a little, sorry. I got quite confused. That wasn't what Mum said, I was sure of it. After a small period of awkward silence as we scrubbed old grit from the oven, I stopped and looked at her. A couple months? She nodded again. Her face seemed cold. Mum said it was 4 years. Pauline stopped for a moment, like she was caught off guard, and then chuckled. Oh, my bad, sweetheart. That must have made me sound like quite the liar. She slapped her hand on my shoulder and chuckled a little more. Your mum must have misunderstood. What I meant was, I can't keep someone in this house for a long period of time. They usually move out after 6 months or so. Some don't even last a full month. She was still chuckling to herself, which made me feel uneasy. It wasn't really a funny misunderstanding, just a simple mistake, but she laughed so awkwardly, like she was laughing out of courtesy at a bad joke. I turned back to the oven and started scraping away. I wondered why people couldn't stay long. The house was nice, well kept, fairly large, and even still had a decent amount of furniture. I dragged my head from the oven and got her attention by tugging on her dress like a 5-year-old. Why don't people stay? I asked, as I stood to my feet and dusted my knees off. Pauline let out a little sigh and then tossed her rag into the sink. I should have told you from the beginning. She walked out and waved a hand for me to follow. She took me to the bathroom and then pulled the door of the shower open and pointed to the drain. There's something wrong with the plumbing. I've had people come to look at it, but it can never seem to be fixed. A rancid smell occasionally lifts up through this pipe, and a few folks have claimed they saw fatty hunks rise from it. Their best guess was the sewers are backing up into the house's plumbing. I don't know how it works, so I just took their word for it. She looked to me with a worried smile. Sorry I didn't tell you. That's not fair on you. I told her it was all right, and then I stuck my head in to look closer at the drain, and then I could smell it. It smelt bad, like someone had left chicken out for too long, and it had gone sour. But admittedly, it wasn't too awful. They moved out over that smell? I asked with a soft chuckle. Not even that bad. You have nothing to apologize for, Pauline. After that, I was all moved in, and after the first week at the new house was when I got the symptom. I had a nightmare about a car accident, and in the dream, the steering wheel pushed into my chest, crushing my lungs. When I awoke, I still felt that crushing feeling, and once again, I was locked into my own body. What was strange about the sensation was that it didn't match any description of what I read online. Online people say that the sensation is like a singular, unmoving weight on your chest. Like it sits mid-chest or closer to the stomach, and it remains until you finally snap out of it. But in my case, it started at my belly and shifted up my body. Also, it wasn't in one spot. It almost felt like something was wrapped around my torso, like rope loosely tied around my body. Strangely, the sound of footsteps and whisperings were gone and instead replaced by a steady, rhythmic breathing. I needed to prove nothing actually bad was happening to me, so I fought to open my eyes, but my body just didn't let me. I strained and tensed, but nothing worked. Frustrated, I stopped and let whatever this symptom was pass. When it did, I felt sick. The symptom didn't just stop abruptly or fade slowly. It stopped naturally. The weight around my torso lifted, like something was grabbing my whole body and decided to let go. The breathing sounded like it turned away from me, and then I heard the hallucination leave. Heavy footfalls across the carpeted floor, and then wet slapping as it hit wood and tile. I heard it walk through my house. Its breaths were still loud enough to make out from a fair distance, and then it disappeared. It sounded muffled suddenly, before I couldn't hear anything at all. A soft rattle filled the empty air briefly, before still silence came to me again. Then I woke up. I sat upright for a moment to gain composure, and then hung my head in my hands. It was awful. It was by far the worst hallucination I've ever had, and if it became constant, I feared I'd need psychiatric help or pills. After 10 minutes or so, I laid back down and fell asleep again. The following morning, I looked around my house, almost paranoid, as if someone actually got into my room and held me down. I felt stupid when I checked underneath my bed like a child looking for the bogeyman, but I needed to be sure. I went to the bathroom, and the smell had gotten slightly stronger, but not by much. It was still easily tolerable. I did see the fatty substance, though. It had collected around the rim of the shower grate, but not through the slats that hair usually gets caught in. It almost looked as if the fat was placed along the rim, and someone closed the grate over the top of the gooey substance. Strangely, the smell wasn't coming from the pasty pink fat. It was coming from something in the pipes. Out of courtesy, I informed Pauline. The fat showed up in the drain. She thanked me and said she could get a plumber if I really needed one, but reminded me that they never seemed to find anything, so I passed on the offer. The hallucinations went back to normal for maybe a week and a half. Then the awful one came back. This time when I awoke from some kind of dream, I was on my side, facing the wall. Immediately, I knew I was paralyzed, so I tried to pry my eyes open. As I tried and struggled, I felt something nudge my back, a small push. It didn't feel like a hand. It felt more like a dog pushing its forehead into you to get pats. I was shocked, but just kept telling myself it was a hallucination, which calmed me down. Push. It shoved me harder. I felt my body rock slightly. Was I twitching to match the sensation of the hallucination? Is that possible? Move, a gurgled voice said behind me. Right behind me, right behind where I was pushed. Move. It sounded like someone was talking in a cavern, but the exit to the cave was directly at my lower back. I was horrified. Normally the voices are whispers, not a speaking voice, and not that close. I needed to open my eyes. I had no other choice. I pulled and pried, and finally they snapped open. I stared at the blank white wall, lit in a faint red of my alarm clock's light. I then saw, like clockwork, the Hat Man just in the corner of my vision. I felt so relieved. The voice must have come from him, right? Have you died? The voice echoed again. It paused between each syllable. My stomach sank. The voice had come from behind me. The fucking Hat Man was in front of me. I then felt one final mighty shove, which rolled me face down. I stared into my pillow. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't lift my head. I then heard the soft footfalls of the thing behind me leave, followed by the exact same noises as last time. Wet slapping, then a vibration that filled the house. I didn't even care. I was face down in my pillow, and I couldn't even get a breath in or out. I tried so hard. I tried to suck air in, but only got nosefuls of fabric. Try going to the yard. It keeps the flies off your back. The regular hallucinations kicked back in. It startled me, but I needed to force myself to wake up fully. I strained my neck. I pulled up as hard as humanly possible. My head was getting light. I could see stars in my vision. No, it's serious. I have it. I was dying, and the last thing going through my head was the ramblings of an insane hallucination. In one final attempt, I reefed my head off my pillow, and the ramblings stopped. The Hat Man gone. I coughed and then cried. Why did my own body try to kill me? I went to the bathroom. More fat rimmed the drain, the smell still the same. I looked closely at the pinkish flesh. It was wet. It had just come up. Disgusting. I went to Pauline's house the following morning. The drain had bothered me, and the hallucinations made me want to double-check if there were any way to set up security cameras, just in case. Pauline invited me in, and we discussed the plumber. She said one would be in within the month. I then brought up the hallucinations. I explained what sleep paralysis was, and why these hallucinations had me more freaked out. Pauline then went pale. She stood from the dining table we sat at and got herself a glass of water. Pauline, are you all right? I went to follow her. She slammed her glass on the counter, and her look of fear turned to anger. How hard is it for you to make yourself move when this paralysis stuff happens? I was taken back by the question. I was asking for security cameras, and she seemed upset that I get sleep paralysis. I responded, very difficult. I nearly suffocated last night. She got closer to me. Next time something is grabbing you, Bailey, maybe have a sense of agency and move yourself away. I didn't understand. Was she mad at me for not keeping myself safe? Was she confused? I couldn't think of a response. Pauline mumbled a string of vulgar nonsense and then looked at me. Bailey, please understand. I get that what's happening to you is all in your head, but when it happens, really try and push yourself. If there's something in your room, you need to get yourself out, right? I nodded. Right, obviously. After a few more tense moments, I excused myself and left. As I opened the front door, Pauline caught up to me. Your mother says it's your birthday tomorrow? I'll look into getting some cams as a late gift. I nodded. Sounds good, thank you. I gave her an awkward hug and parted ways. The whole encounter bothered me. Why did she say something instead of someone when referring to the hallucinations in my room? Why was she mad at the fact I have a condition I couldn't control? I decided to distance myself from her. My only guess at the time was that she just didn't believe sleep paralysis was real, and I was some stupid teenager hiding from an intruder instead of getting help. The most recent hallucination is why I made this post. From what I can tell, visually sleep paralysis hallucinations are just blobs or vague shadowy shapes. They normally don't have color or vivid details, right? It was a night ago, a week after the pillow incident. I didn't even awake from a dream like normal, but I was on my back. I felt relaxed, loose. I nearly felt like I could move, but I didn't. I was too scared. The sound of heavy breathing was directly above me. It sounded like wind blowing through a cave tunnel. I felt it in my face. I felt the warmth of something or someone breathing onto my face. Bailey, she calls you Bailey. The echoed voice gurgled forth from the abyss. Never in 8 years had a hallucination used my name. Never. I was horrified. I was on the verge of tears. Bailey, have you died? The voice asked like it had the other night. Pauline had been right. If this person was real, I needed to move. I needed to run. I went to struggle to open my eyes, but instead they flung open with ease. Lit only by the faint red from the clock was a being so horrific I don't know how my mind could have conjured it up. Looming over me was a man, maybe 7 feet tall. He wore no clothes and stood naked in my room. Where the genitals would be was just mushy flesh, scanning up and down the torso. It didn't have a chest, just a flat slab of skin, no details. Its legs were thick like an elephant's, but its feet were long and stretched under my bed and out of sight. Its arms were the normal length a human of his size would be, but its hands resting on my bed were the length of his forearm. Each finger the length of my forearm. I then noticed one of its hands was already wrapped around my leg as if it was ready to yank me off. Its face, though, its face is where it becomes sickeningly vile. His mouth and nose jutted out like a horse. The nose resting on the upper lip tilted towards the roof, even as it looked down at me. The eyes were bulbous, and on the side of its head, they scanned the room like a chameleon, rotating independently. His teeth were a disorganized mess, no symmetry, no rhyme or reason to their placement, just a mess of busted browning teeth. Its mouth was agape. It felt like it was ready to bite into me, but instead a voice exited its throat. Without moving its mouth, it spoke from within its neck. Your eyes are open? It shifted its head so only one eye could gaze at me and investigate me closer. Are you awake, Bailey? The echo made sense. The voice was escaping from its barrel-like body and leaving through its elongated maw. I can only feast on those who are awake. I so desperately wanted to sprint. I wanted to shove it down and run for my life, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, right? Honestly, I was too scared to check. Lost chances, Bailey, it gargled out. As it spoke, its teeth started to move, rotate around its gums like a chainsaw. The top and bottom rows rotated in opposite directions, and as they slowly spun around this thing's jaw, blood and drool formed and dripped from its gums to its lip. The sound of the teeth shifting through its gums was like cutting through raw beef with a dull bread knife. A soft sloshing could be heard as the mixture of drool and blood flooded down its neck. The grip on my leg grew tighter as the thing got closer to my face. A wad of drool slowly dripped out onto my pillow. It was maybe 2 inches away from my face when it screamed. "Wookie up, Bailey." The voice sounded like an explosion echoing out of a coal mine. Drool flicked over my face, some into my open eyes. It stung. It shouldn't have. It was a hallucination. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. I stood my ground. I didn't move. I didn't whimper. I even tried to blink as rarely as I could. It then let go of my leg. Its teeth slowed to a halt and it turned away, the breathing moving away with it. Then the wet slapping and the vibrations filled the house. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to try moving. I couldn't prove to myself that what just happened was real. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I repeated that to myself until finally, after maybe 2 hours, I fell back to sleep. The following morning, this morning, I woke up. I had drooled in my sleep and it was all over my pillow. The strange, fatty substance rimmed my drain again, so I decided to head to Pauline's to get an ETA on this plumber. I knocked on her door but got no answer. Strange, I thought. She was usually cooking breakfast before I even woke up in the morning. I could smell it through my window. I decided to have a quick walk around to the back door, in case she had fallen or had an accident. As I crossed past a window, I saw red. So much red. It was the bathroom. I peered in. Where her shower drain was, stood a pile of gore. An arm stuck out and around it a thick hunk of skin. It bloomed out like a rose from the drain. I saw a trail of blood lead out of the bathroom and down the hall. Holding back vomit and forcing myself not to scream, I ran around the back of the house where she had a sliding glass door to get in. I prayed it was unlocked and yanked. It slid open. Bolting inside, I followed the red trail of crimson blood. It led to a room at the other end of the house, her bedroom. Laying on her pillow was just her head. Where her neck would have started was instead torn flesh. It looked as if it was shredded or ripped by small, dull blades. I started screaming and took off out of the room, immediately phoning the police. When they arrived, they were shocked and confused. I told them my sleep paralysis and the fatty substance in the drain. They didn't believe my sleep paralysis story, but seemed very interested in the substance. About an hour ago, I received a call from an officer I spoke to earlier that day. "Hey mate, how are you holding up?" he asked. His tone was soft but concerned. "I think as best as I could be, given the situation," I responded. "Now, Bailey, I think it's best for you if you find somewhere else to stay tonight. I think Pauline got herself mixed up in something nasty." The officer cleared his throat, and I heard the rustling of papers. "We've never heard of a criminal organization that specializes in just indiscriminate murder, but we believe that's what happened here. Pauline kept a journal of people who lived on this street. We double-checked each name, and they correspond with names of people who have gone missing within the past 4 years. Your name is at the bottom of that list." My heart sank. Pauline was trying to kill me? How? Why? The officer continued, "We believe this killer couldn't get into your house, and so as punishment, killed Pauline. We believe a chainsaw was used on her neck, and they used some form of long wire to try and pull her corpse into the sewer via the drain. How they expected that to work is beyond me. But when we examined the local waterways, storm drains and sewers, we found mounds of rotten flesh, bodies, the newest being around 2 months old." He continued explaining the details and how insanely long a wire or rope needs to be to pull a body from a house's drain system into the sewer, but they had done it numerous times. Most of the bodies were missing limbs or hunks of torso, and the cops think that Pauline was sent to clean up what they left behind. I had one last question for the officer. The dead bodies explained the smell, but what was the fat around the drain hole? We couldn't get a DNA match, but it's some kind of natural lubricant. We think the killers used it to yank as much of a person as they could into the drainage system. Now I'm sitting here, lost in thought. The serial killer story makes some sense to me, but that monster felt so real. My mind could have just made it up to explain Pauline's weird behavior. So, does sleep paralysis normally get worse? If you thought that was scary, the next one is even worse. I didn't believe the legend about spirits knocking on door until I heard a knock on mine. Growing up, I often overheard snippets of an old, unsettling legend whispered by the elders in my family. According to them, when someone in the house dies, their spirit might return, knocking on the door, bringing with them the emotions they felt at the moment of death. If they passed away peacefully, they would bring positive energy. But if they died with anger, regret, or sorrow, they would return with darkness in their wake. The legend was always vague, though. No one ever said what exactly would happen if you answered or ignored the knock. But I didn't pay much attention to it. As a kid, it was just one of those creepy stories you hear, but don't really believe. Years passed and I grew up. I got a steady job, moved out of my parents' house, and eventually found myself sharing a small studio apartment with my girlfriend. It wasn't much, just a single room with a tiny kitchen and a bed in the corner. But it was ours, and we were happy. Life with her is good. Actually, it's better than good. But like any relationship, we've got our quirks. I've got this little hobby, obsession with video games. I can lose hours, even days, in those virtual worlds. On the other hand, she's the organized one, the responsible one, and she's always the one making sure everything's in order. It's not that I don't help out at all, I do sometimes, but she's the one who really keeps things running smoothly. I know it might sound like I'm just being lazy, but we've found a balance that works for us. She's the kind of person who needs to keep busy, and I'm more laid back, let's put it that way. And honestly, she doesn't seem to mind. We laugh about it, joke about how I'm glued to my games while she's the one making sure we don't starve or drown in dirty laundry. It's our thing, our dynamic, and it's been working just fine, until that night when everything changed. It started out like any other evening. My girlfriend asked me to go to the grocery store to pick up some items, but I was in the middle of a game and couldn't pause. I told her I'd go after I finished the round. She just sighed, kind of annoyed, but didn't argue. A few minutes later, she left to do the shopping herself, leaving me engrossed in my game. Time flew by, and I lost track of how long she'd been gone. It must have been a couple of matches later when I heard the front door creak open slightly. I glanced over and saw her peeking through the gap. She softly asked me to come over, saying she needed to talk. I noticed she wasn't wearing any pants, just standing there with her top half covered, the rest hidden behind the door. I thought she was trying to tease me into leaving my game, so I laughed and told her to wait a minute while I finished. But her tone changed quickly. The soft invitation became a demand, then escalated into angry shouts. She screamed, her voice twisting into something sharp and unnatural. It startled me so much that I dropped the controller and stood up. Just as I was about to walk toward her, my phone buzzed loudly on the table beside me. It was a call from one of my friends. I picked up, not thinking much of it, but the urgency in his voice made me freeze. He told me that my girlfriend had been in a car accident right outside the store near his house. He said she didn't make it. The police were there, about to take her body away, and I needed to get there right away. I felt my heart drop, but disbelief quickly took over. I snapped back at him, telling him it wasn't funny because she was right here, standing at our door, calling me. But he insisted she was gone, that he wasn't joking, and I needed to come now, his voice even cracking. Confusion and fear gripped me. How could she be dead if she was right here? Without thinking, I rushed to the door and yanked it open. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. There she stood, but it wasn't her. At least, not entirely. On one side, she looked just as beautiful as always. Her skin smooth and flawless, her long hair cascading down in soft waves, her lips curled into a soft, almost serene smile. But the other half was a mangled horror. Flesh was torn apart, hanging in ragged strips, barely clinging to the bone beneath. Her bones were shattered, jutting out at grotesque angles, sharp and jagged like the teeth of some monstrous beast. Where her skull should have been was a gruesome, caved-in cavity, exposing the splintered bone and the dark, pulpy remnants of what had once been her brain. Her eye on that side dangled from its socket, swaying slightly as if it might fall at any moment. Her torso was ripped open, a horrifying tear from her shoulder down to her waist. Her ribs were broken and twisted, some snapped in half, while others had pierced through the remaining flesh, their sharp ends glistening with blood. Inside, her organs were a tangled mess, spilling out and hanging limply, swaying with each small movement she made. The sight of her intestines, slick and covered in gore, intertwined with the shards of bone, sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. I slammed the door shut immediately, my hands trembling as panic surged through me. My mind was racing, my heart pounding so hard I could barely catch my breath. What was that? What had I just seen? The legend. I suddenly remembered the legend, but it came flooding back too late. I wasn't sure. Was I supposed to open the door? Or was that the one thing I shouldn't have done? My thoughts spiraled out of control. Confusion and fear tangled together as I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The next thing I knew, she was at the window, her mutilated face pressed against the glass, still screaming at me. I grabbed anything I could find to block her out, shoving furniture in front of the window, but she just moved to the vents, the small gap under the door, every crack and crevice she could find, her voice haunting me, cursing me for all the things I hadn't done, for not going to the store, for not helping around the house, for everything. In my frantic state, I wrecked the entire apartment, barricading every possible entry point. I was a mess, sweat pouring down my face, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Finally, I slumped against the fridge, the only solid object left to block the door. I thought maybe I was safe. Maybe I'd managed to keep her out. But as I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I heard a soft creak above me. The fridge door slowly opened, revealing an all-too-familiar face, her eyes now burning with rage and hatred, and a mangled hand reaching out from the darkness within. And then, get ready, because the next story is just as terrifying. It's Friday the 13th, and I met a witch at my retail job. It's September, which means it's nearly my favorite season, fall. Yes, the scorching heat is at last cooling down to a nice middling temperature until the winter chills set in. All the back-to-school supplies have given way to autumn decor, such as fake pumpkins, rubber masks, lawn inflatables, and monster animatronics. Speaking of back-to-school, a bonus is seeing fewer children during the week. Look, I don't have anything against kids, provided they are a minimal distance of 50 feet from me. But when they are running around, screaming while their parents have this vacant look in their eyes, that's when I have a problem. If you happen to disagree, spend a few years working retail at Walmart like I have, and see if you don't change your tune. In fairness, that's only scratching the surface of the problems going on in those stores. As bad as that can be, it's harmless most of the time, only ever going into the make me want to rip my hair out in frustration territory. I can't say the same about what happened today. I work in customer service. Being Friday, things were busier than usual for us. Our manager, Dell, is the superstitious type, and he was adamant that we keep our eyes peeled for trouble since it's also the 13th. While hectic, nothing out of the ordinary happened. That is until we got one particular customer. My coworker, Steve, and I were holding down the fort, trying to help customers as best we could. I was currently having my ear talked off on the phone. I've been a loyal shopper at Walmart for over 30 years. He's already mentioned this several times. I understand, sir. Things used to be great there until your generation decided to screw things up. I'm sorry you feel that way. Is there anything we can do to make it up to you? He went on a tirade that I wasn't paying much attention to since it had nothing to do with the conversation. From what I remember, it was about those damn Democrats running this country into the ground. Several bigoted statements against minorities, how prayer should be back in schools, and that certain people need to go back where they came from. I should mention he was insistent about how not racist he was. I think there may have also been something in there against how communists have infiltrated the government. The call dropped, making me momentarily grateful upper management hadn't sent anyone out to fix the phones. Thank Christ, I breathed, putting the phone down. Tough call? Steve asked, unwrapping a piece of gum. Yup, I feel you on that. Any plans after work? I'm going to be watching a horror movie. Which one? It's called Tek-Teki. Is that Japanese? Yeah, it's an urban legend about a girl who became a ghost after her legs were cut off by a train, and there are 2 movies about it. Steve popped the gum in his mouth. Sounds pretty cool, he said while chewing. Do you want to come over and watch them? Maybe. At that moment, Dell came over, a panicked look on his face. Is something wrong? I asked. Upper management is here, he replied breathlessly. What? We exclaimed in unison. Someone getting carts said he's parked outside. I knew something bad was going to happen today. I just knew it. All things considered, Dell is decent at his job, but when he gets overwhelmed, it's like watching a caffeinated hamster running around its cage. He stopped and took a deep breath. Okay, we can do this. Be vigilant. Steve, spit out that gum. Dell went away to check on the other departments. Rolling his eyes, Steve pulled out one of the trash baskets we keep behind the counter. spitting his gum into it. There tends to be a disconnect between corporate and those who have to interact with people face to face. As such, inspections tend to go as follows. They tell us to jump, and if we come back down without their permission, we get reprimanded. Our strategy is to remain as scarce as possible. Usually, this works. Today was another story. Things were going steady, all things considered, then the horde came. Normally, these are seen further into the holiday season. However, it seems that Dell was right about how Friday the 13th would be affecting things. I was playing Pokemon Go on my phone when Steve nudged me with his elbow. I glanced up, seeing a herd of customers who weren't too happy based on their expressions. They seemed ready to take their anger out on us, hence why we refer to them as hordes. "Ah, shit," I murmured. Then she came. Looks of surprise were coming over people's faces. Someone was pushing their way to the front. We craned our necks, trying to spot who was trying to cut their way to the front. To our confusion, a pointy black hat became visible among the crowd. Attached to it and emerging to the front was an old lady in a baggy black dress with a long hook nose. People tried to tell her off. She gave them such a fierce stink eye they backed away instantly and dispersed. Then she came up to the counter. "Hello, ma'am," Steve said. "Is there something we can help?" Reaching into her pocket, she pulled something out, slamming it down on the counter. It was a cat collar. Then she threw a $100 gift card beside it. A few seconds of silence passed, then Steve asked, "Do you want to make a return?" "I want more than that for the trouble this store has given me." She explained that the adjuster was faulty and that the collar nearly choked her cat. I tried calling and it just kept ringing. "Apologies, ma'am. It's been a hectic day. We'll do what we can to make this up to you." "Is that so?" A grin crept up her face, showing rows of deep yellow, misshapen blocky teeth. "I think I deserve a little extra for all my trouble. Give me this gift card for free and we'll call things even." The thing about the customer always being right is that it goes off a cliff if the store's bottom line might be affected. Well, I need to check with my manager if I am allowed to do that. Steve went away to call Dell. Meanwhile, sending a growing tension, I attempted to diffuse it. "Hey, great costume," I told the old lady. "Are you getting ready for Halloween early?" She seemed confused. "What costume?" "The one you're wearing. You're dressed as a witch, right?" Her eyes narrowed. "I'm not dressed like I am a witch." "Oh, I see. My bad." She relaxed a little. "I do have a lot of preparations to make for the upcoming holiday now that you mention it. Where's your friend?" "Sorry about that. Our manager is busy. I can't reach him," Steve said, returning from his call. "I'm normally not supposed to do this without permission, but I can help you out this one time." The old lady seemed satisfied with that response. Steve was about to activate the gift card when we heard someone speaking with Dell. "Everything is up to standard so far. Which way is customer service again?" "This way, sir." With Dell was our distract manager, Edmund, who looks a lot like Kevin O'Leary. He's the kind of guy who thinks the company's standards should be rigidly enforced. In short, doing the opposite of what he says would likely improve store experience. They saw what was happening and came over. "Good afternoon, miss," Dell smiled and told the old lady. "I hope your needs are being met." "Yes, I suppose they are. These two are taking care of something for me," she replied, gesturing at us. "At least some people can do something right in this dump." "Well, it's nice to hear from a customer that our employees are on top of things. Out of curiosity, what are they helping you with?" Steve was tapping his fingers on the counter. He only did that when he was nervous. I could tell he was thinking, "Please, don't mention the gift card." She did exactly that, prompting Steve to curse under his breath. At the mention of it, Edmund decided to get involved. "Now, hold on," he said to the woman. "How much did you pay for that collar?" "15. And how much is the gift card you want worth?" $100. Edmund looked at Steve. "You authorized this without permission?" Steve may as well have been a deer in headlights. "What were you thinking?" Edmund chastised him. "I was just trying to do the right thing." Steve replied before being cut off. "The right thing within reason. I thought you would have figured that out by now," the old lady interjected. "Wait a moment. Are you saying I won't get my gift card?" "Yes, that's what it means, sorry to say." Her eyes erupted with anger. I came out here and waited all this time. Not accustomed to dealing with other human beings, Edmund disregarded her, trying to pass her on to Dell. She didn't take too kindly to that. You respect your elders when they are talking to you. Edmund ignored her and was about to walk away. The woman crossed her arms. If that's what you want, we'll play hardball. I will give you one chance to change your mind about the gift card, or there will be hell to pay. His response conveyed he wasn't the least bit intimidated. The answer is still no. She pointed a shaking finger at him. I warned you. Suddenly, her eyes rolled in the back of her head, and she began chanting. I think she's having an episode. Edmund snorted. That seemed to be the case until the light started flickering. An uneasy feeling worked its way up my back. Then all hell broke loose. Edmund was talking to Dell about his new car when, while cackling, the woman rose into the air, her eyes filling with inky darkness and her teeth becoming red and pointed. I'll teach you to deny me what I am owed. We stared, mouths agape, as things were rising around her and the lights were flickering. Several patrons pulled out their phones to attempt recording her. She wasn't having it. Different colored whips swirled around her. They made groaning noises. These must have been the souls of her previous victims. Pointing her finger at our Halloween display caused the souls to go into them. The lawn decorations came to life, fueled by the power of the dark arts. Next thing we knew, they were off their shelves and going after people in the store. There was so much happening at once, it's hard to process. The fake jack-o'-lanterns latched onto those trying to get footage of the event. An inflatable Frankenstein monster and mummy were picking people up and fighting each other with them. Lastly, a Grim Reaper was flying around, decapitating people. Heads flew and blood squirted everywhere, all while that wicked ancient woman was laughing as if this was the funniest thing to ever unfold. Several security officers who were at least 30 pounds overweight tried shooting at the old lady while she was distracted. Not even bothering to glance at them, she made several lights fall on their heads. Then they dropped to the floor, dead. Nearly shitting ourselves, we hid under our desk for cover. Now do you see what happens when I am denied what I am owed? Edmund replied, voice trembling. Okay, I'm sorry. You'll get your gift card. It's too late. You had your chance. Now, you'll pay. We heard him run away crying, repeating a bunch of curse words to himself. Suddenly, our desk broke off from the floor, flying through the air at unfathomable speed. Along this, several large and heavy objects were sailing through the air. Then there were several distant thuds. She's blocked the exits, someone shouted in panic. We're all gonna die, another person shrieked. Look at them, squirming like the pitiful ants they are, the woman sneered, going after them. Seeing where she was going, we chose to go the opposite way under the assumption it would be safer. Help. Dell's voice came from somewhere amidst toppled shelves. We were able to lift the one he was trapped under high enough for him to squeeze himself out. Thanks, guys. Damn, this Friday the 13th. You do everything you can to prepare and you still get blindsided. We need to hide somewhere, I said. Let's head to the break room. Yeah, once she has Edmund, she'll probably calm down. Her next words proved things weren't going to be that simple. Where did you go, you sniveling little snake? There was only one person she could be referring to. If you don't come out now, I will destroy this entire store. Not being one to think of the well-being of others, Edmund stayed hidden. What do we do now? Steve asked, panicking. Dell slapped him across the face. Pull yourself together, man. We survived 4 Black Fridays together. We can survive this. You two, find Edmund and drag his no-good ass back here. You're staying here? I said, shocked. His eyes lit with a sharp determination. I'll be dealing with that crazy old lady. How? With superb customer service. Take this. He handed us his phone. We went off to search for Edmund, having no luck. While doing so, we saw that the curse had spread, bringing other objects to life. Several people lay in the kitchen aisle with knives sticking out of them in a pool of blood. One person's hand was in a blender. Several of our coworkers were sitting huddled in pools of blood, hugging their knees to their chests, rocking back and forth. Another person lay in the middle of the appliance aisle with a waffle iron clamped over his face. The disturbing part was, it still smelled kind of nice, like fresh waffles. This is fucked on so many degrees, I said. wondering how we had managed to survive up to this point and worried that could change at any time. I'm with you. I'm applying to Target after this. Where do you think Edmund could be hiding? Steve asked. I don't know. A realization hit me as we reached the clothing section. Wait, duh, I said to Steve's puzzlement. The phone. Oh, using Dell's phone, we called Edmund's number. Instantly, ringing sounded nearby. We realized it was coming from a changing room. Steve kicked the door open, showing Edmund huddled in the corner, fumbling in a panic to decline the call. We tried pulling him outside. No, she's after me, he whined, clinging to the door frame as we were yanking on his legs. It's a bloodbath out here because you had to be a fucking douche, so take some responsibility, Steve screamed. With a final pull, the weight shift sent us crashing into a nearby display of horror and pumpkin shirts. We got to our feet. Edmund did as well. A "They Live" shirt showing the aliens covered his head. Snatching it off, he threw it to the floor. How dare you, he snarled. I am your superior. You'll end up in the prison showers when I am through. Before I was aware of what was happening, my fist was thrusting forward, connecting with his nose. I can't decide which gave me more pleasure, feeling the bones in his nose break or seeing blood gushing from his nostrils. Whichever, it will be a while before anything tops the satisfaction I was experiencing then. Edmund staggered back from the blow, pulling down several shirt racks as he fell backward. There was an expression of disbelief, as if some natural order had been violated, and his mind was trying to make sense of it. My eyes went from him to my fist. Something to note about me is I am a non-confrontational person to a fault. Therefore, of all the stuff we'd witnessed that day, what I just did stood out as being especially unbelievable. Holy shit, dude. I didn't think you had that in you. Neither did I. We dragged Edmund to the front, where that elderly woman had Dell by the throat. They'll be back soon. Just give them a little longer. It's too late. We had an agreement. Her fingers squeezed his neck, making his eyes bulge. Stop, I shouted. Her head whipped in our direction. Then her lips curled upward as she was lowering herself and Dell. Well, you made it after all, she told us, and then said to Dell, I guess you managed to survive by the skin of your teeth? Consider yourself lucky. She tossed him aside. He hit the wall, sliding down it with a groan. Steve went to check on him. It was now me, Edmund, and the old woman. Her gaze alone was piercing, and her smile only added to its iciness. Your manager cut me quite the deal. Not only do I get $400 worth of gift cards now, I also get to do as I please with this slimy little worm. Those words seemed to snap Edmund back to the reality of the situation. His breath hitched, and he tried in vain to flee. The elderly woman sent her souls after him, which wrapped his body. He was carried back, thrashing. Please, don't kill me, he begged through tears. I'll do anything. Don't worry, I won't kill you. Edmund's teary eyes filled with optimism. No, I have a better use for you, the old woman said. What occurred next is something that's forever seared into our memories. She raised her finger, lifting Edmund. The inky darkness shot out of the elderly lady's eyes, spreading out and wrapping around Edmund. Screams erupted from within it, and we could hear the sounds of bones breaking as they were compressed and rearranged. The woman reabsorbed the inkiness, revealing what became of Edmund. A loofah on a stick matching the color of his suit fell into her open palm. I could have sworn I saw it quiver. The implications of Edmund's fate caused me to shudder. I believe that wraps everything up. Let this be a lesson. Never try to cheat me. The woman was about to leave. What are you? I blurted. Her eyes met mine, then she grinned again. I already told you. I'm a witch. She threw something made of glass down, shattering it and causing a green cloud of smoke to appear in the store. When it cleared, she was nowhere to be seen. I can't begin to convey the clusterfuckness of trying to explain what happened to the authorities. The cops around here aren't into doing their job when it counts, so they as well as chalked everything up to an act of God. In any case, that store will be closed for a while, which means we have to go through the pain of job surfing. Oh well, we can check out those teke-teke films in the meantime. I'll conclude with this. Never mess with a witch, especially when it's Friday the 13th. The last story was creepy, but what comes next is even darker. Why forest shadows are about to change your perception of fear forever. A few years ago, my friend Tim and I were looking for a new adventure. We had already explored many popular hiking and camping spots, but we wanted something different this time. We wanted to go somewhere far away from the usual places. After doing some research and talking to locals, we decided on a remote area deep in a forest that was known for being isolated and a bit mysterious. We set out early on a crisp autumn morning. The sky was clear and blue, and we were excited about our trip. We packed our camping gear into the car and drove for hours. The road wound through beautiful scenery, but soon the landscape changed to thick, dark woods. By late afternoon, we arrived at a small parking area surrounded by towering trees. The trailhead was hard to find, covered in weeds and vines. It felt like the forest was trying to hide its secrets. As we ventured deeper, the trees grew even taller, and their branches twisted in strange shapes. The path became rough and uneven, and the forest seemed to close in around us. We hiked for hours, our excitement keeping us going despite the challenging trail. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the sound of leaves crunching underfoot breaking the silence. As the sun began to set and shadows grew longer, we found a small clearing. It was a quiet and peaceful spot, lit by the last rays of sunlight. Ancient trees surrounded us, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves. A cool breeze blew through the trees, making it feel like a perfect place to set up camp. We quickly set up our tent and gathered firewood. Soon, we had a warm fire going, and we cooked our dinner. The crackling of the fire was comforting against the growing chill of the evening. We enjoyed the peacefulness of the forest and chatted about our day. As night fell, the atmosphere began to change. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, and rustling animals, faded away, replaced by a deep, heavy silence. The temperature dropped quickly, and a thick mist began to roll in from the trees. It spread across the clearing like a living fog, curling around us and making everything look strange and blurry. We tried to shake off the growing unease. We laughed and joked, trying to distract ourselves from the eerie mist and the darkness. But then, out of the fog, a figure appeared. He was an older man, probably in his 50s, with a rugged face and intense eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Glenn, a park ranger who patrolled this remote area. Mr. Glenn's sudden appearance was startling. He warned us that this part of the forest was known for strange and frightening events, and advised us to be careful. His serious tone made us uneasy, but we thought he was just trying to scare us. We had camped in many strange places before, and had always managed just fine. Before leaving, Mr. Glenn gave us one last intense look and disappeared back into the mist. We watched him go, feeling a mix of curiosity and worry. The fire continued to crackle, but the sense of unease grew stronger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the clearing and making everything look like a ghostly blur. The air grew colder, and the silence became almost unbearable. We huddled close to the fire, trying to stay warm. The mist seemed to make everything colder and more isolating. Then we heard a strange noise, a low, melodic humming. At first it was soft and almost soothing, but it quickly grew louder and more unsettling. The sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the mist. We looked at each other, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The humming was soon joined by whispers, faint and barely audible at first, but growing clearer and more frightening. The voices spoke in a language we didn't understand. They seemed to come from the mist itself, surrounding us and making us feel deeply afraid. The whispers were accompanied by a rhythmic, distant beating, like a drum. I glanced at Tim. His face was pale, and he looked scared. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the mist grew thicker and started to form shadowy figures. These figures were tall and thin, with glowing eyes that cut through the darkness. They seemed to glide through the mist, getting closer and more menacing. Fear took over. We grabbed our backpacks and tried to understand what was happening, but the shadows seemed to close in on us. The whispers grew louder, filling our heads with terror. The mist felt alive, wrapping around us and making us feel trapped. Suddenly, Mr. Glenn's voice cut through the chaos. "Get out of here now!" he shouted from the edge of the clearing. Without thinking, we grabbed our things and ran. The figures and whispers followed us, but the mist seemed to part, creating a narrow path through the forest. We stumbled through the darkness, branches scratching our faces and roots threatening to trip us. The forest felt alive with a dark energy, and the mist seemed to try to pull us back. The shadowy figures stayed just out of sight, their presence felt but never fully seen. We pushed ourselves harder, driven by fear and adrenaline. The mist seemed to close in behind us, making every step feel like we were racing against an unseen force. Finally, after what felt like hours, we burst out of the forest and into a small clearing where our car was parked. We jumped into the vehicle, slammed the doors shut, and drove away as fast as we could. The mist began to lift and the whispers faded, but the fear remained. We drove in silence, the night's events replaying in our minds. When we finally stopped at a diner hours later, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We talked about the shadowy figures, the humming, and the whispers, but nothing seemed to fit. The experience felt like a strange, frightening dream. The next day, still shaken and desperate for answers, we decided to find Mr. Glenn and thank him for his help. We called the local ranger station, but when we described him, the woman on the other end went silent. "There hasn't been a ranger named Glenn here for over 20 years," she said quietly. "He disappeared in those woods and was never found." The news hit us hard. We stared at each other in shock, realizing the terrifying truth. Whoever, or whatever, saved us that night was not a man but something much older and connected to the forest's dark history. We never went back to those woods. The memory of that night still haunts us, a chilling reminder of the unknown and the unexplainable. The mist, the whispers, and the shadowy figures remain a part of our shared experience, a terrifying reminder of the supernatural and the eerie mysteries that lie beyond the edge of the known world. The fear doesn't stop here. Let's move to the next story. Sleep talking. The nightmare started over a month ago when I heard my husband mumble. "He's standing in the garden. He's looking in the window." It must have been 2 a.m. I sighed and rubbed my eyes. You could set your watch by him. At that time, my sleep had been disturbed regularly by Daryl's sleepwalking and sleep talking, and sometimes sleep yelling. He'd never done anything like that before. It had just started out of the blue about 3 days prior to that night. That night when he was whispering, mumbling while he dreamt. His voice was low and hushed. "He's trying to get inside." I couldn't help but look over at the curtained windows. I imagined that if I pulled the curtains aside, I'd see a ghostly hand pressed up on the window pane. The little hairs on my neck stood on end. I shook my husband awake. He jolted like he'd just tripped over something and his eyes shot open. He breathed heavily but quickly came to. "Was I talking again?" he asked, out of breath. Sweat beaded his forehead. "Yay, it just keeps getting creepier." My eyes were wide. He looked over at me, his face tired. "Was it the guy in the garden?" I nodded. "Yay, you said he was trying to look through the windows." He rubbed his eyes and replied, "I can't remember really. It's so vivid while I'm asleep, but as soon as I'm awake, it just slips away." I rubbed his arm, trying to comfort him. "Let's try and get back to bed. We need to pick up Jacob early." He nodded and got out of bed to fetch some water and a melatonin pill. I drank the rest of some cold chamomile tea I'd not finished the night before. Then we went back to bed. It was about 3 a.m. when we fell back to sleep. At 7 o'clock the next morning, my alarm rang loud and shrill. I kept my eyes closed as I fumbled for it and hit the snooze button. By 7:30, we were up and on our way to the train station. Jacob was waiting for us with a large suitcase and an old, worn backpack. Jacob was our nephew. He was a scrawny guy with dark brown hair and bright green eyes. Jacob had just started his final year at university and was studying zoology. He was considering starting veterinary school after his bachelor's degree was done and was visiting schools around the country. Daryl and I lived near a large veterinary hospital and school, so Jacob had come by to see if it was any good. He knew we were in the area, and so he decided to stay with us in the meantime. His eyes were dark and exhausted as we pulled up. "How was the train?" I asked as he climbed into the back seat. Daryl loaded Jacob's suitcase into the trunk and got back into the driver's seat. Delayed and uncomfortable. I was just managing to get some sleep right as I arrived. "Figures," Jacob said, his voice irritable and feeble. "Well, you can get plenty of rest at the house. It's quiet at the moment with everyone away for the holidays. The family of 4 next door is in Ecuador." We continued to chat as Daryl drove us home. Jacob mentioned he was excited to check out the school and would leave to take a tour the next day. I asked Daryl to drive him, but Jacob said he'd rather take the bus so he could get to know the area better. The day after that was Sunday, so we slept in and had breakfast food for lunch. After that, Jacob left for the bus stop. Daryl and I did some chores, and then we sat down to read. The air was peaceful and quiet. I remember it was the last time I had felt relaxed, felt normal and comfortable in my own home. The day had been warm and bright, and sunbeams illuminated small motes of dust in the air. Pretty soon, Daryl and I both fell asleep on the couch, leaning against one another. Suddenly, there was a loud shout, and I sat up, my eyes wide and suddenly very awake. Daryl was sitting up straight, his chest heaving heavily with breath. That was a bad one, he panted. What happened? Why did you shout? I asked, my hand on my chest. I was dreaming about that guy again. Except he wasn't alone this time. This time he was with a woman. They were standing just outside. He turned to look at the window. They were throwing rock. Out of nowhere, there was the deafening shatter of glass. I yelled. Daryl leapt to his feet in fright. I glanced down at the floor. Among a pile of broken glass lay a single rock. It was small, dark and smooth as glass. As soon as I looked at it, I felt a cold trail of goose flesh run down my neck and arms. There was something so unnatural about that rock. It looked artificially polished. Daryl and I ran to the window, carefully avoiding the shards. There was nothing outside save my front yard. My petunias and crane lilies waved gently in the breeze. No one was standing there. The air was thick with silence. All the neighbors were still away on holiday. Daryl and I looked at one another, our eyes searching each other's expressions for some kind of explanation. I was hoping Daryl would declare himself the mastermind of this terrifying practical joke. But no confessions came. Must be kids playing a prank, he said as he cleaned the glass and tossed the stone into the yard. But his face was still white and his hands trembled. He wasn't quite convinced. Later that same evening, Jacob returned from his sightseeing and was thrilled. We decided not to tell Jacob about what had happened, and Daryl, being a very proficient engineer, had already replaced the window pane that afternoon. Jacob couldn't stop going on about the facilities and the local cafes. We were happy for him as we ordered pizza and watched some silly rom-coms. We all went to bed at around midnight. As I lay in bed and turned off my light, I couldn't help but look over at the curtained windows momentarily. The curtains hung ruby red and still as stone. Was there someone standing outside? I shivered as I rolled over in bed and cuddled up close to my husband. I was glad to have my back to the window. I felt like I'd just closed my eyes when I was disturbed. I had turned over while half asleep and found myself suddenly alone in bed. It's always disconcerting to find yourself unexpectedly alone in the middle of the night. At first, my face still buried in a pillow, I figured Daryl was on the toilet. As I rolled over and opened my eyes, I noticed a figure standing at the foot of our bed. It was Daryl. I jumped from fright and yelped. "My God, Daryl, you frightened me," I said as I clutched my chest and breathed hard. "What are you doing standing there?" I asked. Daryl did not stir. His back still faced me. He seemed to be staring at the curtains in front of him. Then he spoke, and it filled me with terror. "They're outside. They're calling," he said, his voice flat and vacant. He was sleep-talking again, and now he was sleepwalking. I felt my stomach fill with boiling lead. "Come back to bed," I said shakily as I slowly sat up. Something wasn't right. "They're outside. They're coming." His voice sounded slurred, like he'd been drinking. Daryl took a few quick steps toward the window. I felt my heart skip a beat. I ripped the duvet off my legs, but as my feet touched the floor, there was a tremendous smash. I screamed as the window to my right shattered into 1,000 pieces. The sudden commotion made me lose my balance, and I fell on the ground hard. I felt a frigid gust howl through the broken window. "What?" I didn't get a chance to finish speaking before the window in front of Daryl exploded too. The wind that blasted through was so strong and cold it forced my eyes closed. My teeth began to chatter. How was it suddenly so cold? Daryl? The wind died down and I opened my eyes. Daryl was gone. My mind felt empty. My limbs were heavy. Confusion washed over me. "Daryl?" I said again. The wind had vanished, and the chill in the air had retreated completely. I slowly stood. My eyes searched the ground for signs of another rock, but there was nothing. I walked up to the closest smashed window. When I looked outside, all I saw was my garden shrouded in darkness. The half-moon was obscured by wispy clouds. "What?" I whispered, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I suddenly heard a hoarse whisper behind me. "Auntie Valerie, what's going on?" I spun around to see the dark silhouette of Jacob standing in my bedroom doorway. I could just make out the look of worry on his face. "I'm not sure. Your uncle is missing. I'm not sure what happened. The windows, they broke. I think I need to call the police." I hurried over to my phone and called 911. Within 15 minutes, 2 exhausted-looking police officers arrived and took my statement. I trembled as I spoke. I told them everything. I told them about my husband's dreams. I told them about the smashed window from the afternoon, and I also showed them the mess in my bedroom. They were sympathetic and offered to drive me to the hospital for a checkup. I declined. I just needed rest. They told me not to worry, that my husband probably hadn't gotten far, that he must have broken the windows in his sleep. When I tried to tell them there was no way my husband broke the windows, one of the cops said, "Look, people can do weird and out-of-character things while sleepwalking. We once had to go fetch some teenage kid from some park in the middle of the night. He was up some tree and refused to climb down. He'd done it all in his sleep. They said they'd look around the area and let me know if they found him." Jacob gave a statement too, but he had been asleep. After he heard the windows smash, he'd gone through to investigate. A few minutes after the police left, I found myself sitting on my couch with a cup of cocoa clutched in my still shaking hands. Jacob sat near me and tried to comfort me. He got me a blanket. I was still unable to comprehend what had happened. My eyes stared into space, unblinking. Where had Daryl gone? Who were those people? I felt a lump of dread lodge itself in my stomach. What the hell had happened? A week went by. The police still had no information. Jacob postponed going home to help look after me. He was really such a sweet kid. It was late in the afternoon and I was preparing lunch. Suddenly, Jacob walked into the kitchen. Auntie Valerie, can I talk with you?" I stopped dicing onions and looked up at him. His expression was guilty. He was awkwardly rubbing the back of his neck with his hand. "Yes, what's up?" I said curiously, putting down the knife. He looked embarrassed. His eyes couldn't meet mine. I kind of lied. To the police. And you. About what happened that night, last week, when it happened. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My heart fluttered. What do you mean?" I said. He paused. It seemed to last forever. The room felt so silent I could hear my heart thump loudly in my chest. Jacob still couldn't meet my gaze as he replied, "I forgot to close my curtains that night, and something must have disturbed me in my sleep, because I woke up in the middle of the night before the windows smashed. When I sat up in bed, I froze. I saw people standing outside, at least a dozen people. I couldn't see their faces, just dark shapes, their outlines. They were all in the garden. I didn't know what to do. Then suddenly I heard the windows smash, and I got distracted. I looked away from my window for a second, and when I looked back, he paused. Tears were now forming in his eyes. I saw Uncle Daryl. He was standing right at my window. He was staring in at me. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew it was him. Slowly he turned around and walked away. As I blinked, he vanished. That's when I got out of bed and came out to see you. I was convinced I had dreamt the whole thing. I mean, how could that be possible? I was scared the cops that you would think I was crazy. But now I don't think it was just my imagination. I've seen them again. Not in my dreams. I mean, I saw them outside my window. I saw them last night. I don't know what's happening. I think I should go home, but I don't want to abandon you." He was crying now. His voice was full of fear. I was shaking. I tried to keep my voice calm. "Don't worry, my boy. Everything's going to be fine. I'm sure it was just a dream. I mean, I didn't actually see anyone else myself. The police are probably right. They'll find your uncle." I gave him a big hug. "Maybe it would be a good idea for you to go home. You must miss your own bed. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. And after everything that's happened, you should go home. I'm sure your parents are anxious to see you. Let's get you sorted." Within an hour, Jacob was packed, and I drove him to the train station. We didn't speak much on the way there, and when we said goodbye, I gave him an extra tight hug. I'd never admit it to him, but I was dreading going back home alone. Back to that same bed. The bedroom windows had been repaired, but I still felt the cold wind whenever I looked at them. It was 2 o'clock the next morning when my phone started ringing. Groggily, I reached over to my bedside table. I answered, my voice croaky from sleep. "Yes," I said, sitting up. I switched on my light. "They were on the train," I heard a flat, monotone voice answer. A chill rippled down my spine. "Jacob," I said softly. "They were on the train. They found me." All traces of sleep vanished from my voice. "Jacob, this isn't funny," I said angrily. I was terrified at that moment. There was a slight pause before he continued. "They're outside your house too. They're outside. They want to come inside." "What the hell do they want, Jacob? Are you okay?" Suddenly the phone went dead. I just sat in bed. My nerves were burning with fear. I didn't get any sleep that night. I wasn't surprised when I got a call from my sister a few hours later. Jacob had never got home. I told her and the police I'd dropped him off, and the security footage at the train station confirmed my story. It even showed him board the train at 6:30 that evening. He'd taken an overnight train, but the security footage from his destination showed no trace of him. Just like Daryl, he had vanished. I also hadn't told anyone about Jacob's phone call, and the police never brought it up. Had it ever happened? I decided not to tell my sister anything more than what I'd told the police. I felt a numbness in my brain and body that refused to abate. I hardly had the motivation to do anything except eat and drink for days after that. I haven't been able to leave my house for 2 weeks now. I never open the curtains anymore. Every night I sit in my living room, the lights on, and every night since Jacob disappeared, I've heard a gentle tapping, a tapping on my living room windows. Last night I heard their voices for the first time. I heard Daryl and Jacob. They were both calling me, stretching out the vowels in my name as they spoke. Valerie. They want to come in. Valerie. They just want to talk. It's not so bad. Valerie. I felt completely helpless. The police were useless, of course. Whenever I called them and they showed up, the things outside would vanish. They now told me to stop bothering them, or they'd charge me with wasting police time. And it seems that running away wasn't really an option. The sun is beginning to set, and I find myself sitting once again in my living room. I've boarded up all my windows and sit on my sofa, clutching a golf club in my hands. Maybe I can't stop them from getting inside, but I'd be damned if I wasn't going to put up a fight. I've also left myself a secret way out just in case, but won't write that down here. I don't want them to find it out. The sun is now completely gone. I can hear the tapping on my window. It is louder than before. My grip on the golf club tightens. The tapping has now turned into full-on knocking. Someone was banging their fists hard on the boarded windows. I've decided to write this all down so that when I suddenly disappear, people may be able to figure out what happened here. Maybe they can find Daryl or Jacob, or me. But I figure it's likely no one will ever see me again. Perhaps it won't be so bad. At least I will be with Daryl and Jacob again soon. You survived that one, but the next story might be more than you can handle. Don't van life alone. I didn't choose the van life chose me. Something I said often as it was the outro to all my YouTube videos. I've been living in my van for roughly 8 months, and I'm done after this. The day was like any other day. I woke up and started my boring, antisocial life I loved so much. I edited a few videos, ate some leftover meatloaf, and played some video games. You know the basics. I parked the van on the side of a campground up near the Colorado Rockies. It was getting late, and I wanted to use what sunlight I had left to set up camp. The snow was pretty low at that point, probably from a snowfall a few days prior. I got out my fire pit and got a little fire going. I was the only vehicle at the car lot, but I guess that didn't seem weird because it was in the middle of nowhere. As the night grew near, I received a warning on my radio about a blizzard that was due to hit in the next hour. I put my things away and got into my van, bracing for the blizzard. I wasn't too worried as I had a propane heater inside the van in case it got too cold. The blizzard hit, and it hit hard. The wind rocking my van, snow covering the windows and sealing me inside the van. I panicked a little, I'll be honest. The thought of freezing to death flooding my thoughts. I remember laying in bed with my blankets wrapped around me and dozing off. At some point, it got really quiet, so quiet it woke me up. I figured the wind had died down and it finally settled, so I sat up. I wondered if I should go assess the situation and see how bad it was. I'd say it went on for about 3 hours, so it got pretty deep. I decided to make some coffee and warm up before I went out. I started to get dressed and put on my boots. Just as I pull up my boot, a noise catches my attention. What sounds like something trotting through deep snow is making its way towards my van. Heavy footsteps approach from what I figure was about 30 yards out. I don't move a muscle, even my breath slowed down to basically nothing. My body was riddled with goosebumps as fear pulsed through me. My first thought was moose, but then there's also bears out here. I couldn't see anything through the thick snow lining my windows. The footsteps were about 10 yards away at this point, still making their way towards me. My body begins to shake violently. I'm not sure if it was from the cold or the fear, but I couldn't stop. I could hear what sounded like humming coming from the direction of the noises. It was very low and didn't really sound like anything I knew. It was getting closer and closer. The humming and footsteps were about 5 yards away now, and I was almost certain this was no moose or bear. The footsteps stopped right outside the rear of my van. The only windows I have are the front seat windows, so I can't see anything out of the rear. A voice breaks the silence, cold and small. "Hello in there? May I have a word with you?" It said in a voice from what sounded like a little girl. I almost melted into the ground at that point. My body was absolutely trembling, sweat pouring out from all over my body. Terror doesn't describe the feeling I had at that moment in time. I remained silent, refusing to utter even a breath. Now I really knew it wasn't an animal. First of all, that walking sounded way too heavy to be a little girl. It's almost 1 a.m. right after a bad blizzard, and it's out in the middle of nowhere. No weapon or anything really to defend myself with. I felt absolutely helpless. "Don't be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you. I just need help," it said. "Please do not ignore me. It's very rude," it said in a slightly deeper tone. Yet, I spit out, not being able to talk from the terror I was in. "Is there a problem?" it asked. I slowly picked my head up and looked at the back of the van. I gulped, took a deep breath, and forced out what little I could say. "What's the problem?" I said through chattering teeth. "No, not a problem. I just wanted to ask if you had a tooth for me," it said. "A tooth?" I thought to myself. "You need a tooth?" I asked the voice. "Yes, just a tooth," it asked happily. My mind was in a million different places at this point. Who the hell was I talking to? What did they want with a tooth? Was this some sort of monster you hear about in some Travel Channel show? I wasn't really sure what it was, but I was afraid nonetheless. I began to reason with myself. Maybe another car pulled up and I didn't realize it, and they wanted to play a prank on me because they recognized the van. "I don't have a tooth. Can you please go away? This isn't funny," I said. The sweet voice that asked so kindly for a tooth moments ago changed almost immediately into a twisted, dark, deep voice, like some kind of demon. "Give me one of your teeth willingly, or I will rip the teeth from your skull one by one," it yelled. I began to search through my van for a weapon, something I could fight this thing with if I had to. All I had was a hammer that was stashed under the engine hood in the front seat. I raised the hood and grabbed the hammer. I stood in the van, hammer in hand like some dollar store Thor. I turned around, and that's when I remembered the shark tooth hanging from my visor. I ripped the tooth from the visor and went to the back of the van. "I have a tooth for you," I said, body still shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline. "Throw it out now," it yelled again so loud it shook the van. I slid the van door open, only to be met with a wall of snow. I stuffed the tooth into the snow and slid the door closed and locked it. A loud bang on the back doors and a loud scratch followed, all the way from the back to the side door, and stopped. "Thanks for the tooth," it said back in the little sweet voice from before. The humming began again, and the loud, heavy footsteps made their way away from my van. I curled up in the fetal position on the ground of the van until I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. I jumped up, turned the engine over, and began to let it heat up. I sat for about 15 minutes, Then I began the drive back home from my last day as a van life YouTuber. I'm still not sure what to chalk it up to, but I don't see myself going around the Rockies again, ever. The terror continues with the next story, The Inheritance. I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but I'm desperate for help or advice. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I need to share what happened. It all started when my Aunt Meredith died a few months ago. The night she passed, I had this vivid nightmare. I was climbing an endless staircase in a house that kept growing taller. Every time I thought I reached the top, a new floor would appear. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I couldn't stop climbing. I knew that if I did, I'd fall all the way down, back to where I started. I woke up gasping for air, my phone ringing with news of Aunt Meredith's death. After our parents passed years ago, my sister Emily spiraled down a dark path for a few years, leaving me to forge a bond with Aunt Meredith, who rented a small apartment in the city back then. I spent countless evenings with her, sharing tea and stories while gently petting her cat Willis. The reading of Aunt Meredith's will was a shock. Emily inherited a house none of us knew existed, while I got Willis. The injustice of it burned. Emily, who barely called Aunt Meredith except for money, got a home, while I, despite my decent job, remained trapped in an overpriced shoebox apartment. With the housing market as insane as it is, owning a home felt like an impossible dream for me. Our resulting fight over this uneven inheritance left us estranged for months. Then, last night, my phone lit up at 2 a.m. with Emily's name. Liz? Emily's voice trembled on the other end. I need you to come over. To the house. The house. That dilapidated two-story in a forgettable neighborhood with its peeling paint and overgrown yard. The house that should have been mine, or so I'd childishly thought. I swallowed my pride and the bitter taste of jealousy. Em, it's the middle of the night. What's going on? Please, she whispered. I want you to have it. The house. Just come. I was silent for a moment, then scoffed. So you're calling me at 2 a.m. to tell me you want to give me the house you wouldn't even let me rent a room in a few months ago? Are you using again? The irritation in my voice was palpable. No, she clamored. Just come over, please. Each word sounded like it was being dragged over broken glass. I'll come over later today, I promise. I need you now, she cut me off, her voice rising to a near shriek. I could hear her crying, gasping on the verge of hyperventilating. My mind and anxiety raced. What if she was using and alone on a bad trip, riddled with guilt over taking the house instead of sharing it with me? Or what if she was having a panic attack, realizing she couldn't take care of the place or afford it? Could she be in sleep-deprived psychosis and need help? I sighed heavily. Okay, I'm on my way. The drive over was a blur of streetlights and confusion, and as I pulled up to the curb, I had to double-check the address. This couldn't be right. The dilapidated two-story I remembered first seeing a few months ago had transformed. Fresh paint gleamed in the moonlight. The yard was immaculately manicured, and there was even a new porch swing. It looked like it had been plucked from a home renovation show. Still, as I approached, a chill ran down my spine. Even though the house looked beautiful, shadows seemed to writhe across the facade, the darkness of them unnaturally deep. The air felt thick, oppressive, carrying a coppery scent that made my stomach churn. I found the front door ajar. Emily? My voice seemed swallowed by the musty air. Stepping inside, I was struck by the interior. Modern furniture clashed with antique fixtures. Sleek, minimalist pieces sat beside ornate, centuries-old decorations. It was as if the house couldn't decide which era it belonged to. I kept walking as the floorboards creaked ominously under my feet. Emily, I called again. Up here. Her voice drifted down from upstairs, oddly flat. As I crept up the stairs, I felt like I was wading through molasses. Family portraits hung on the wall, their eyes following my ascent. Each step up felt heavier than the last. Dizziness washed over me, and whispers just below audibility swirled around my head. When I reached the top, I saw Emily standing at the end of the hallway, her back to me. Em, what's going on? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned slowly, and I barely stifled a scream. It looked like Emily, but her eyes were wrong, too dark, too empty. When she smiled, it stretched unnaturally wide across her face. Oh, Liz, not Emily said, her voice a chorus of others. I'm so glad you came. We've been waiting for you. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the hallway wall. Picture frames rattled, accompanied by what sounded like children's laughter. What are you talking about? Where's Emily? Where's my real sister? Not Emily's grin widened impossibly further. Emily is here. We're all here. And soon, you'll... I ran before Not Emily could even finish the last sentence. Blind with terror, I crashed down the stairs, slamming into walls as I desperately sought the exit. Behind me, I heard a cacophony of voices, some calling my name with hungry eagerness, others screaming for help. As I burst through the front door, I heard Emily's voice, her real voice, call out from somewhere deep within the house. "Liz, help me! Don't leave me here!" I froze on the porch, torn between self-preservation and the need to save my sister. In that moment of hesitation, I felt something cold brush against my ankle. I looked down to see a tendril of shadow coiling around my leg, trying to pull me back inside. With a scream, I wrenched myself free, stumbling onto the neatly manicured lawn. As I caught my breath, I felt a familiar nudge against my leg. Willis? How did he get here? His eyes gleamed in the darkness, and he meowed insistently, looking back at the house. It was almost as if he was urging me to go back in. Heart pounding, I heard Emily's continued screams for help, and I realized I couldn't leave my sister. I had to find her. I ran back inside, and I followed her voice, dodging grasping shadows and whispers that grew teeth. I found her in the attic, surrounded by dust-covered relics and dozens of mirrors. As I reached for Emily's hand, I noticed her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes, once warm brown, now reflected the room like polished glass. Not Emily's voice echoed around us, seeming to come from every reflective surface. As she spoke, her mouth moved a fraction of a second after the words, like a badly dubbed film. "Oh, Liz, Aunt Meredith always said you had your father's eyes." Her head tilted at an impossible angle, neck stretching unnaturally. "Come, see for yourself. These mirrors don't just reflect us, they receive us." The temperature in the attic plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs as Not Emily continued, her smile widening beyond the confines of her face. "We're the legacy this house inherits, piece by piece, generation after generation." As she spoke, I saw flickers of other faces superimposed over hers. Men, women, children, all wearing the same grotesque smile. The family album is always expanding, and there's a frame waiting just for you. Emily. I grabbed her ice-cold hand, but as we turned to flee, the attic door slammed shut. One ancient-looking mirror began to ripple like disturbed water, and the floor beneath us softened and shifted. I leapt for the door, but Emily sank into the now liquid wood, her eyes wide with terror. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed my sister was her reflection in the mirror, now calm and serene, taking its place among the house's eternal residents. I managed to wrench the attic door open and tumble down the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, speeding away from that cursed place. As I sit here typing this, I'm shaking. I don't know what to do. Emily's not just trapped there. She's become a part of that monstrous dwelling. I can't go to the police. They'd never believe me. I'm going to start researching, try to find a way to end this. But I'm scared. What if I can't stop it? What if I go back and become part of the family portrait? I don't know how I'm going to sleep tonight, but I am comforted that Willis is here snuggling next to me. Still, as I look at him, I can't help but wonder, why did Aunt Meredith leave him to me in her will? You might want to turn on a light for this next one. False awakening. I dreamed of it again. That building. Its features have become so distinct to me by now that I even now see it outside of my sleep, like a waking dream, with its front porch leading directly to me. It seems inviting somehow, almost daring me to enter the realm behind that wooden door. I know it sounds insane, and even writing it down now I question my own sanity. This is all out of context for you, though. Let me start from the beginning. It all started exactly 5 days ago. I was hanging around my third-floor apartment, just about to make myself some dinner, when I heard a sudden knock at the door. I wasn't expecting any visitors, obviously, so I went and opened the door to see who was rapping at my door. To my utter surprise, it was my father's attorney. Shocked, I invited him in, and we began to get to the bottom of his mysterious and sudden visit. "Your father has passed away," he said, his words piercing the air of curiosity and replacing it with an air of grave seriousness. I never did get along with my father. He was a paranoid asshole, and I hadn't even talked to the man in years. About 10 years to be exact. His wish was for you to inherit your childhood home. He continued. His words shocked me even more than the news of my father's demise. Last time I talked to my father, he gave me the impression that he would rather burn that house to the ground than see it in my possession. "You're sure you've got the right guy?" I asked. He reassured me and even read out my father's will. I couldn't believe it. Why did he have such a change of heart? When did he make the decision? Did he even think to update it after our last altercation? My silent questioning was interrupted by the Jew, the attorney. He had gotten up and was heading for the door. "Wait," I yelled. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I pleaded, praying for an answer. "Don't know, and I don't care," came a callous response from the man, now turning the knob and preparing to exit. If I were you, I would try to push it onto some other poor sap. His advice made sense to me. I had no desire to keep the place. All my memories of that accursed building invoked an almost rage-like state the more I thought of them. I thanked the man as he left my apartment, and I went back to my previous engagements. That night, I had the oddest dream. It was like one of those dreams where you can't tell if you're awake or asleep. This was followed by the oddest realization. I was in a forest. Before me lied a log cabin, the layout of which was oddly familiar to me, compared to the untamed wilderness around me. It looked like a single-floor building with a porch immediately outside the front door. It had a rail, and to the right of the door were 2 chairs on either side of a medium-sized window. I felt compelled to see what lay inside the house, though my view inside was obstructed. There was a large tree to the right of the cabin, its limb hanging in such a way that it obscured my view into the window. All I could see was that there was a light on inside the cabin, though there was something that almost felt wrong about its quality. I moved to get a better look, but immediately upon the first twitch of a muscle, I jolted awake. Upon waking that day, something felt off. I couldn't quite tell what it was, but that wasn't even the focus of my attention at the time. There was a feeling that seemed as though my entire body and my entire consciousness were working in tandem to protect me from something. I know that sounds stupid, but that is the only way I could describe this feeling. This was all but immediately pushed out of my mind, though, as when I looked at my alarm clock, I was shocked to see I was late for work. I hurried to get ready and headed off to work. I went to work that day, trying to banish last night's dream from my mind. It all but worked until I got home to see someone had taped something to my door. I quickly looked around, and I could not see anyone. This was actually really odd, because normally my neighbor would normally get home around this same time. We had many conversations through the years as we were both entering our respective abodes. I dare say it was through these that we even became friends. My mind was torn again from my reminiscing when I reached my door. It looked like someone had taped one of those really large orange envelopes to my door. I was reasonably concerned by this development. Nobody had plans to drop anything off, and it couldn't have been the post office, as I had a mailbox right downstairs. I hesitantly grabbed the envelope and began scanning it, hoping to find something on its exterior that alluded to the identity of its deliverer. But all I found were some odd-looking shapes. I walked inside to try and see if I could find out what on earth was going on. I looked for a few hours, but to no avail. I think it may have been some sort of like a cipher or something, but I wouldn't even know where to start with all that. The only reason that comes to mind is one of my best friends in high school was really into that stuff, and I just remember when he would show me some of the ciphers, they looked like a completely different language to me. Anyway, I debated with myself for another 30 minutes on whether or not I should open up that mysterious envelope, but at the end, my curiosity got the better of me. I opened it up, and what was inside shocked me to my core. It was a blueprint, but not just any blueprint. It was a blueprint of my childhood home, the one that I had just yesterday been informed was now under my possession. Needless to say, I was creeped out. I didn't even know how someone would get access to these blueprints. I decided to look them over a little clearer, and upon further examination, there were some oddities on these blueprints. There were rooms on that blueprint that I do not remember being there. Some background. I am 29 years old, and last time I was in that house was about 10 years ago. I didn't explore the house much when I was older, but as a child I made it my mission to know that place front and back. I knew every single crevice of that house. Granted, it has been a really long time since then, and I am almost 100% sure most of my knowledge of the place is all but lost, but I think I would have remembered several entire rooms. I wasn't sure if they were fake or of some other similar house, but there was one way to find out. I had to go back there. I debated going to the house that day. After all, how could I know what any of this means if I didn't find out why someone had given me these blueprints? I will admit, I had my reservations about going back to the place. My memories of the place are not fond, but the feeling of not knowing was worse than reliving all of that. I decided I was going to call off work the next day, and I was going to go to the house that night. I needed to know why my father handed the house over to me, why the blueprints were on my door, and I needed to find out what the connection of that odd dream was to this whole scenario. I have no proof yet of that last point, but everything in my being is telling me that these series of events are definitely connected. So, I packed up an overnight bag and I headed out. I was in the car for about 4 hours before I got to the house. I was tired as hell, and I was ready to be rid of all this weird stuff. I arrived at the house at about midnight, and when I got there, what I saw looked like a whole new property. I couldn't understand why the lawyer had called me a poor sap. I had imagined that he was referencing the recent passing of my dad, but upon looking at the house that night, I had understood why he said that. The house was overgrown. It looked like no one had even taken the slightest bit of care of the place since I left. I thought about how hard it was going to be to sell the place, and how much work I was going to have to do if I were going to sell the place. I began to unpack my bags, and I swear I'm not a paranoid man, but I could swear that when I got into the house and unpacked my overnight bag, I saw someone out the window of my old bedroom. I was sure there wasn't anyone out here. The house is in the middle of nowhere. I quickly ran down and turned the lights on. My old bedroom faces the same way as the front door, which leads to a porch, so I turned on the porch lights as well and began to scan the area in which I spotted the figure. Nothing. I must have stood there staring for about an hour, trying to rectify the discrepancy between what my eyes were looking at and what I thought I had seen, but there was no one there. I chalked it up to sleep deprivation, mostly because I hadn't slept much in the last week, but I was on edge the rest of the night. Work had been incredibly busy for the last month, so I wasn't sleeping very well. My mind then refocused on the idea that I hadn't slept well in the past week, and for the first time in the last couple days, I began to look forward to something. I was looking forward to getting a good night's sleep. I turned off the porch light and went back upstairs. That wasn't the last weird thing to happen that night. It was the middle of the night. I had long since gone to sleep, and I must have been in a pretty deep sleep. I woke to the sound of my phone ringing, though it must have only been for a second, because when I looked at my phone, it had since stopped ringing. I looked at the number, but I remember thinking it was impossible that I was getting a call from that number. It was a number I was very familiar with, because it was a number I had memorized when I was a kid. This one was special, though. Just as I had come upon that thought, my attention was drawn away from my phone by a sound so faint that I couldn't even convince myself that I had heard anything. If that were the end of it, then I would have just brushed it off and went back to sleep. But something else then caught my attention. My eyes had to adjust from the light of my phone to the pitch black of the room around me. I scanned the room so many times that I swear I could draw a map of the dark room, but on the last scan something caught my eye. I don't even know if I could call what I saw a silhouette, because it blended in so well with the rest of the dark room. I tried to focus on it, and as I did, the sounds of crickets began, and it got really intense. I had become so engrossed in the sound of crickets that I failed to notice that the thing was moving, and it looked like it was moving toward me. It was so weird, and looking back now, I couldn't be sure I was actually even awake. The image of that cabin had flashed in mind, and suddenly I was sitting up in my bed in a cold sweat, but it was day now. I looked at my phone, and it was 10 o'clock in the morning. I checked the fridge for anything edible before I would begin the arduous task of confirming whether or not the blueprints I had received were accurate, or if my recollection of the old place was as on point as I hoped it was. Of course, there was nothing in the fridge. It looked like no one had gone to the grocery for months. There was spoiled food everywhere, so I shut the refrigerator door, and I decided I would make the 30-minute drive into town to grab something to eat. As I walked out of the house into the front yard, and at this time, the full scope of the degradation of the house truly came into view. The roof looked like it was sinking in a few different places, and the wood around the sides of the house were peeling as well. The lawn was overgrown, almost to the point that it looked oddly out of place for the house to be where it was. With the realization of how much work was truly ahead of me, I left to go into town. It was a fairly pleasant drive for the most part, but about halfway to town, I noticed something. There was a car that was behind me for a while. I saw it pull behind me not long after I left the house, and it had been behind me for about 20 minutes. Just as I focused in on it, the car disappeared. I'm aware of how this sounds, but it was gone. I even pulled over and looked around, but to no avail. Things were getting odd now, and I wished only to banish the oddities that had surrounded my life for the last day. I got back in my car, and I finished my drive into town. I went to a diner that I remembered from my childhood, and I even, to my surprise, saw an old friend of mine while I was there. I had walked into the diner, and as I was going to sit down, I saw a familiar-looking man, and he must have seen me too, because before I knew it, he walked up to me and said, "Danny, is that you? It's been a while. How have you been?" I soon recognized the man as my childhood best friend Rick. We sat and had brunch. We caught up on what had happened in the last decade, and I filled him in on why I was in town. "Oh shit, man. I know you and your old man didn't get along, but I'm really sorry to hear about that," he said, though I think we both knew the news hadn't exactly been heartbreaking. We finished up our meal and went outside. I don't know why, but I told him about my odd experience the night before. We got to the point where I mentioned the call I had believed I received, and more importantly, the number it had come from. He was dumbfounded, and he repeated the same rationales that I had told myself. "Surely it's just a wrong number. I'm sure that number was reassigned years ago," he said shakily. I agreed, but I'm sure it seemed like I was trying to convince myself of the explanation, then reaffirming his belief. I finished up my story, and we said our goodbyes. We went our separate ways, and I prepared myself for the work to come. I did my explorations that day, starting from the top floor. It was an attic area of sorts, so it didn't take long for me to check out that area. There appeared to be no new rooms either on that floor or on the blueprints I had received, but you better believe I checked every nook and cranny of it. I moved on to the second floor, which should have been more interesting, as there were supposedly 2 new rooms on this floor. I checked for both of them, but neither seemed to be there anymore. Not that I would know if they were still active anyway. I had no idea what I was doing or even how I was supposed to do it. You see in the movies how easy it is to stumble onto a secret entrance or accidentally move a book that reveals a secret room behind a bookshelf. But in real life, or at least in this specific scenario, it wasn't that easy. I soon gave up my pursuit of the rooms and moved on to the first floor, but with not much more luck. Defeated by my failure to find any trace of these rooms, I decided that I was going to start some general cleanup around the house. I had just finished up sweeping when I came upon a big spill across some bricks on the fireplace that sits in the middle of the living room. I grabbed a rag and began to clean up what I hope was just some ketchup or something. I started going at it when one of the bricks started moving. I was confused. All the bricks in that fireplace look as solid as can be, even after the wear that a lack of cleaning had bestowed. Just then, my focus was drawn away from the brick and onto something in the fireplace. Something had just opened. I quickly looked into the fireplace, I moved the cradle in the middle of it, and to my sheer surprise and horror, there was an opening. It looked like a trapdoor had just opened up, and there was a light on in the space that had just opened up. I knew what I had to do. Something inside me knew that I was meant to find this. I took a deep breath and began my descent beyond the threshold of this new opening into the realm below. I was baffled at what I found in the hidden depths. It was a room that was almost a carbon copy of the one just above it. I quickly looked around the place to see if I could find anything off, anything that would give me any hint as to why this room was hidden. What I found terrified me to my core. It was a picture of the house from my dreams. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't even sure the thing was real up until this point, and I was now looking directly at a photograph of it. What's more, I lifted up the photograph and found a map. It sounds really dumb, but it had a big X on it. I gathered that this was where I needed to go. I started looking for any sort of marker identifying where this place was, and I found a set of coordinates on the back of it. I knew what I had to do. I had to go and find this place. I did some more cleaning around the house the rest of the day since I still fully intended on selling the place, but I couldn't shake the image of the cabin from my brain. I was getting ready for bed somewhere around 11 o'clock. I had finished brushing my teeth, and I was about to get into bed when I saw something out my bedroom window. It was a black figure with what looked like glowing red eyes. I know I've said this a lot, but I feel the need to say it again. I know how insane I sound. Hell, I don't even know how someone would even get up to the second floor window that led to my bedroom, but I could see it clear as day. I stared at it for what seemed like an eternity, but the second I blinked, it was gone. I tried my best to sleep that night, but it was not easy. Eventually, I did manage to get to sleep, and I actually slept pretty well that night. I woke up the next morning with a weird feeling. It was one of those feelings that you can't describe why, but something just feels off. I got up and got dressed, and then I went down to the first floor. I had a weird urge to go outside, and when I got outside, I was scared senseless. It was the building, the one from my dream. I tried clearing my eyes, even tried pinching myself, but nothing was changing what I was seeing. There was a very heavy uneasiness inside me. But against my body's better judgment, I began walking toward the mid-sized cabin. The closer I got to the cabin, the more everything inside me was screaming to turn around and run, but there was no way I could do that. I finally reached the door, and I turned the knob. I was blinded by a bright light, and I heard a familiar female voice I never thought I would hear again say, "Danny, is that you?" Just as this was all happening, I woke up in my bed. I was so confused as to what had just happened. That dream felt so real. Was I still dreaming? What was happening, and why couldn't I open that damn door? Why was her voice coming from behind it? It's impossible, I thought to myself. She's been dead for almost 3 years. I tried to not let the bewilderment of that night's dream affect my day, but at this point, it was near impossible. I packed up my stuff that day, and I began a trip that I would soon regret. I was going to go to the coordinates I found on that map, and I was going to find out what was happening. I grabbed my keys and left the house. I put the coordinates into my GPS, and the location popped up as a place in the middle of the forest in Vermont. It was about a 20-hour drive, so I went to get supplies for the drive. As soon as I had the supplies, a few energy drinks, and a few days of snacks, I left on my journey. I got back into the car after walking out of the grocery store, but something started feeling off. I looked around, but saw nothing. I looked into my rearview mirror, and what I saw shocked me to my core. It was the same black figure. Despite it being the middle of the day, the figure still looked almost like a shadow. Terrified, I started my car and threw it into drive, my heart beating out of my chest whilst doing so. I laid on the gas, and as soon as I began moving, it was almost like we teleported. I was now staring down a dirt road in the middle of a forest. I checked my rearview mirror, and the figure was gone, but as I turned back to see where I was headed, I drove straight into a tree. I woke violently in my driver's side seat, the groceries right next to me. I have analyzed this moment thousands of times in my head, and I still can't remember falling asleep. I must have been asleep for a long time, though. since when I gathered my thoughts, the sun was already setting. Something was happening to me, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. I knew one thing for sure, though. I needed to get to this place, and I needed to get there soon. Just as I began preparing for my journey, though, I looked at my forehead and saw a nasty gash right across it. These dreams were no longer just dreams, but something else. It was no longer just my sanity on the line I feared, but my life as well. I began the long drive to the location, and with the help of those energy drinks, I soon almost reached my destination with no incident. About 5 minutes before reaching my destination, I entered a long dirt road. It was the same one I had seen in my dream. I was driving down it for only a minute when the dirt road suddenly stopped. I could go no further in my car. I got out and put my keys in a backpack I had packed back at my childhood home. I began to walk, but as I entered the dense woods before me, my phone began glitching. I'm not talking about the kind of glitch where you just lose service and can't get directions, but the kind where your phone just becomes unusable. In utter fear, I hit the thing against my hand, but to no avail. I knew I would have to just start walking and hope that I was going the right way. I began walking, and the deeper in I got, the more I got the feeling I was being watched. I walked for about 10 minutes, and that's when I saw it. It started with a familiar-looking creek, but when I kept walking, I saw it. The cabin was right in front of me. It was an older-looking, unkept cabin with a set of stairs leading up to a porch and a front door. There was a window off to the right side. I was half expecting myself to wake up any second, but the closer I got to the building, the more I was sure this was the real deal. Terrified, I began inching closer. I was almost on the first step to the porch when I saw a deep orange light flick on inside the window, and a terrifying sight came into view. It was a dark figure with what looked like bright red eyes, and it was staring right at me. I stopped in my tracks, the fight or flight question firing off in my head, but after a few moments of deep breaths, I was able to calm myself enough to slowly and shakily make my way to the door. I grabbed the handle, still expecting myself to wake up at any moment, but I would have no such luck. As I grabbed the doorknob, I had the sudden urge to turn around, but I would soon regret this decision. Inching toward me from the tree line were 3 mangled beasts. One resembled a leopard, one a lion, and one a wolf, but they were all horribly disfigured. The leopard had a missing bottom jaw, a missing eye, and its legs looked like they had been reformed after going through a meat grinder. The lion looked like it had been caught in a forest fire. Its skull was visible on half of its face, where it looked like the flesh had burned away, and its mane was singed almost completely gone. The wolf was the most terrifying, brandishing 3 heads, each emitting a rotten stench and dripping white foam. I rushed to open the door. I didn't know or care what was on the other side at that point. I just needed to get away from these hell creatures. I slammed the door behind me and turned around. I focused in to see something that was incredibly odd. There was no window. There wasn't even a room. There was just a long, dark hallway that seemed to lead to an orange light, reminiscent of the one I saw in the window. I didn't know what else there was to do, so I began walking down the hallway. As I inched closer, I began to see what looked like cells along the walls. I reached into my bag and grabbed a flashlight I remembered I had packed. I quickly turned it on to look inside the rooms, and what I saw made me stagger back and almost made me vomit. There were grotesque creatures inside these rooms, each containing human features, but none of which I could classify as human. Each creature was different, but each one was equally as disgusting as the last. One had ears all over its body. Another had no eyes at first glance, but upon further investigation, its eyes were in its hands, and it was pointing those hands directly at me, and was making a noise I could almost describe as a grunt. I looked at another that was obese beyond what I thought the human body could handle, and it was sitting in the corner, seemingly unable to move. Just as I got turned away from the grotesque creature, I saw something that terrified me far beyond what I thought was possible. I looked down the hallway to see a creature now standing in the way of the light. It looked humanoid at first, but then it began to shift its appearance. Across the hallway, I could hear the cracking of bones and what I think was the sloshing of muscles. Its appearance had changed so much that the once humanoid creature now looked like nothing I had ever seen before. It looked as if the creature now brandished the skull of what looked like a deer, with the antlers protruding. The creature was now also about 6 feet taller, now coming out to about 15 feet tall. I then heard something that sent chills down my spine. "Danny, is that you?" echoed down the hall in a familiar female voice, one that I hadn't heard for years before the dreams started. It was the voice of my dead girlfriend, who had died in a tragic drunk driving accident about 3 years ago. I froze. I didn't know what was going on, only that my heart was now beating so hard that I swear it was beating out of my chest. The creature tilted its head and began moving toward me. I tried everything in me to move, but I couldn't. As it got closer, I could see its almost ashen skin. Its red eyes grabbed my attention as well. Was this thing the thing that had been taunting me for the last 5 days? It continued to get closer, and as it did, the smell came into range. The creature smelled of rotting meat, but I was still so frozen I couldn't even gag. It was now running on all fours toward me, but I still couldn't move. It must have been almost 10 feet from me when I was finally able to force myself to move. I began slowly but surely inching my way toward the door. Whatever was on the other side was surely better to face than whatever this thing was. My knees were trembling so bad that I couldn't manage much more than a slow jog, but the thing was gaining on me. I finally reached the door, but the thing was only a mere foot away. I threw the door open and forced myself through the door. I slammed the door, but it caught on something. The creature's massive, clawed hand had made it through the door, and it had now grabbed my backpack. I wrestled myself away as hard as I could, and eventually I made my way free of the creature's grasp. To my surprise, it quickly retreated its hand back inside the god-forsaken building, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out why. To my utter surprise, the beasts were also gone. I took the opportunity and ran. I ran so fast and for so long that it felt like my legs might give out below me. I finally caught view of my car, and I shut myself inside it, locking the car as I entered. I was exhausted. I scanned the area, and there was nothing that I could see, but that didn't mean anything at this point. I decided it didn't matter at this point, and I quickly fell asleep. I dreamed of it again last night. That accursed building now stains my subconscious. I never wanted anything to do with that building or its contents again. That was until I checked my backpack to see that there was now a large hole in the back. The contents had likely emptied themselves on the porch, and I now knew exactly why the creature had retracted its massive clawed hand. I searched for hours, but my keys are gone. False Awakening Part 2, Part 1. Hey guys, I know it hasn't been that long since my last post, and I'm sure that you all have a lot of questions. I wanted to get this all written while the memory was fresh. A lot has happened since my last post, and in such a short time. I must have sat in that car for hours, but the sun never came up. Since my car keys were now in that infernal house, and my phone was going back and forth between working and not working, couldn't say what time it was. The only thing I knew, and I dreaded it with every fiber of my being, was that I needed to go back into that house and get my keys. I couldn't walk back to the nearest road, especially not with those beasts lurking in the woods. It was only a fit of blind insanity that the thought of them was pushed out of my mind long enough to get back to my car. I sat in that driver's seat for hours debating what I was going to do, but I only had one choice. I needed to go back into that god-forsaken cabin. Even with those beasts in the woods, it was my only option, really. I finally figured that I could die in my car like a coward, or I could face the challenge in front of me, and quite possibly die doing so. I finally made a decision, and I grabbed what was left of my backpack, and I got out of my car. The crisp air of the pitch-black night shocked my senses a little when I got out of the car. I quickly looked around as if it would help me any. It was so dark outside that I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. The stars shone through the canopy of trees, but it was almost like the area around me was devoid of their light, or of any light. I took one big, deep breath and started walking. It sounds crazy, but I swear I could feel the pull of the building guiding me back to it, like some unseen rope was tied around me. That was the deceptive nature of the building. It offers a guiding hand in unfamiliar terrain and then ensnares you like a Venus flytrap. I was about 3/4 of the way there when I heard a low growl. I now knew they were watching me. Unsure of whether they intended to harm me or not at this point, I continued cautiously walking. The low growl was soon replaced by crunching leaves behind me, and I quickened my pace. As soon as it came into view, my heart sunk. The beast had left a large scratch mark on the door right above the door handle. I wasn't quite sure before, but could now see how close the beast actually came to grabbing my hand instead of ripping a hole in my backpack. I could see where the contents had spilled out onto the porch, and in a vain attempt to save myself a trip inside that building, I frantically searched for my keys. No luck. I had to prepare myself for the journey ahead now. I had to go back inside. I turned around to see something that shook me out of my pensiveness. The beasts were there again, but this time they weren't just sitting there. They were coming closer to me. I quickly stood, grabbed the handle, and entered the building. The long hallway was before me now, and that glow from the other side of the hallway sent chills down my spine. I cautiously advanced, looking everywhere for that creature I had run into last time. I came upon the cells. I was shocked. There were more cells there this time. Where last time I could count maybe 9 or 10, there were easily 20 cells lining the walls now. What was happening? Who or what were these things in the cells? Both questions that would have to wait for now. I heard a noise coming from the opposite side of the hall. I quickly ducked away and slid onto the wall. My hope was that it was dark enough that whatever made that noise couldn't see me. I was searching through my backpack, trying to see if I had anything I could use against the unseen threat, and eventually I found a can of pepper spray. An odd choice, I'm aware, but you can never be too sure of who you'll see in the woods. I also didn't own a gun, so this was all I had. I also had some hope that it would enough to stop a bear, but that was just me being cheap, so I didn't have to shell out more money for bear spray. As I grabbed the can, I saw something at the end of the hall. It looked like a person, but unlike last time I thought I saw a humanoid silhouette, it didn't change. It kept walking towards me, and I prepared myself to use the pepper spray in the hope that it would give me enough time to run at least. "That won't do you much good here," came a gruff, old-sounding voice from the direction of the silhouette. I held up the can, ready to spray it in a moment's notice, and I began walking toward the figure. "Who are you? What is this place?" I asked, hoping my attempt at confidence would somehow dissuade the figure from attacking me. "Neither you or I have time for me to be answering questions," the reply came, knocking away any hope that I had that I would get any answers. "I assume you've become well acquainted with the beast, which also means that I assume you don't want another run-in with it, so we have to get moving before it finds you." The man's comment had a double-edged effect of reassuring me that I wasn't crazy, but also reaffirming that what I was experiencing was in fact real. "What is it?" I asked, hoping to get any answer. "It is known by many names, and it speaks in many tongues that are not its own." His reply came, shocking me not only because the man actually answered my question, but because his response meant that the voice that I heard before wasn't just me imagining things. "Quick, we need to get going now. It knows you're here, and it won't take long for it to find you," said the man. He turned around and began walking toward the orange glow, and against my better judgment, I followed. As soon as we entered the realm beyond the hallway I had come to know, what I saw nearly made my knees give out. It was like an underground city. The place was lit in orange by some unseen light source. The buildings around the city looked dilapidated and out of place in the massive cave-like area. "We must go," the man said. I could now see him clearly. He was a Native American man and looked to be about in his 60s. He wore what looked to be a shirt made of hide, and there were beads strewn about it. He had his gray hair pulled back and braided, and in the back was a single feather. He carried a bag, its contents unknown to me. I think he noticed me studying him, because he quickened his pace and said, "We have to hurry. This beast is a true hunter. It will not take long for it to locate us, even on the move." I matched his pace, and we continued on our way. "How did you get here?" I asked the man, hoping his answer wouldn't come in the form of silence or another scolding reminder to keep walking. "I was sent out into the wilderness to hunt the beast by my tribe elders," he replied. "I was among the best of our hunter. I could track a deer for miles with but a few tracks in my wits. I was sent with several other, but none of them made it this far." He replied, "Time moves different in here, so truly I do not know how long it has been." His reply came with a hint of sadness. We went on in silence for about another 30 feet. Then he said, "Stop. This is the place." It was an area that narrowed out around the odd-looking buildings. It seemed to be an odd place to stop, as it dead-ended not too far in front of us. The man took off his bag and began searching it. He pulled out 4 items: some sage, a flint, some other rock I didn't recognize, and what looked like a very shiny metal knife. It almost looked like the knife was made of silver. As he laid them out before him, I heard something spine-tingling. "Help!" cried a voice from somewhere in the direction we had just come. I instinctually got up and began heading toward it, but I was stopped by the man. "Don't!" he yelled, his yell making me freeze in place. "It is trying to draw you to it," he said, as he stood up and looked me in my eyes. "We must make it come to us," he said. "Hold on a minute," I said, shocked to hear his plan. "I thought we were staying away from it, not trying to take it on. Last time I even saw this thing, I barely got away with my life." He stared at me, his eyes piercing my soul. "You cannot run from this creature. Many have tried, and I myself have even attempted to do so. It hunts without tiring. It will not stop until it catches you." His words frightened me to my core. How could I escape this thing if it never stopped looking for me? A feeling shot right through me then and there, and I then made a decision I was sure to regret. "All right, what's the plan?" He described how the creature would come to us, and he would wait for it to get close. He would light the sage, which he believed would ward away the creature. I would then come around the creature with some sage as well, essentially trapping the creature. He would then advance and stab the creature in the heart with his knife. It was a bit of a half-baked plan, if you ask me, but I hadn't been able to come up with a better one. He handed me the sage, and just as he did, I saw something round into view. It looked like a child, which was different than last time. It had me fooled at first. The child was crying, but when it went to say something, its voice distorted into something hellish and only barely reminiscent of a child. "Can you help me?" As it said this, the tears stopped and the child began smiling. Its head cocked to the side the same way it had during my last encounter with the creature. I began hearing sloshing and the cracking of bones. The childish figure began distorting and stretching, the skin tearing from its increasingly exposed grayish limbs. By the time it had finished its transformation, the creature was close to 15 feet tall, the skin of the child hanging from its frame. I was horrified, to say the last, at what I had just witnessed. The creature began sprinting on all fours at me, its speed even more astonishing than during our first encounter. I couldn't move. I just stood there frozen. "Move," the man yelled, and when I could not, he reluctantly lit up his sage and ran toward the creature. It must have had a weaker effect than he had anticipated, because I could almost see fear growing in his eyes the closer he got to the creature. He didn't stop. He began slowly circling the creature with the sage. I still couldn't move. With one swift motion, he lunged at the creature with his knife. He missed, and the creature swiped its massive claw at him, tearing the flesh on his back. He screamed in pain, but never let up. He gained his position again, and this time he lunged at the creature's chest. The creature barely had to make an effort this time. It grabbed his hand and pulled him up until his feet were no longer touching the ground, and his face and the creature's face were level. It looked at him with its cold red eyes, and in one swift movement, it shoved its other clawed hand right into his chest. He dropped the knife, and I just stood there. I went to drop the man, but with his last breath, and with everything he had left in him, he shoved the sage directly into the creature's face. It reeled back screaming, each second bringing a new voice with it. The sound was even more horrifying than the sight of the creature dropping the man's limp body in front of it. I don't know why, but I knew this was my opportunity. I gathered everything I had in me, and I ran over to the man, finally breaking my paralysis, and with his dying breath he uttered the words, "Finish the job." I grabbed the knife from beside the now lifeless husk of the man that had been so kind as to save me from a similar fate. I knew what I had to do. I ran up to the creature, which was still screaming and reeling. I ran up, and before I could even get to it, it swung its massive claw at me, sending me flying to the side. I dropped the knife as I soared through the air, and it seems my approach was all the creature needed to gain back some semblance of composure. I had sage of my own, but it was probably useless unlit. I stood up and the creature was staring at me. Rage filled its eyes as it focused on me. I began running toward the knife, but it beat me there. I tried turning to avoid the worst of it, but the creature swung its arm at me, and the feeling of its claws tearing my flesh made me scream. It bolted toward me and bolted to where the man had left those two rocks. I grabbed them and struck them together, making sure the sage was positioned in the line of the sparks. The creature was upon me now, the smell of rotting flesh filling my lungs. I almost gagged because of this, but my focus kept me from doing so. Just in time, the sage lit. I looked up, and it was one bound away from reaching me. I mimicked the dying actions of my friend, and I grabbed the sage and shoved it forward, hoping that I would be able to make contact. It ran directly into my hand, snapping the bone with the sheer impact. I screamed in pain, but so did the creature. My hand was bent completely backwards, the bone very visible. I didn't have time to focus on the pain. As quickly as I could, I ran over and grabbed the knife. The creature looked more in pain this time than last, and the screams of 1,000 men, women, and most chilling of all, children rang throughout the area. I grabbed the knife and ran to the creature, which was reeling in pain on the ground. I saw its chest was exposed, and I took the knife and did exactly what the man had planned to do all along. I stabbed the creature in the heart. Must have done it at least 20 times. All I know is that by the end of it all, the creature was no longer screaming. I saw my keys on one of its antlers, and it was almost a funny sight. I had come so far just get these damned keys, and look at all that ensued. I grabbed them and ran for my life. I ran all the way back to the accursed hallway and through that infernal door. The beasts were no longer along the tree line and bolted in the direction I had burned into my memory. I must have been running for hours, but it didn't matter. There was enough adrenaline in my system to kill a full-grown elephant. I got back to my car and the pain of my arm came back to the forefront. I took my belt off and tightened it as tight as possible to staunch the flow of blood. I had done all I could with that. I turned on my car. The sound of it starting almost sounded like a choir. I drove as quickly as I could to the nearest hospital. I arrived at the hospital, and they rushed me into surgery. They were surprised that I had arrived alive from all the blood that I lost. I got my arm all put back into place, and they put a cast on my arm. Said I had to wear it for like 6 months for the bone to heal properly. I got out of the hospital and went home. To be clear, I went to my familiar 3rd-story apartment, not that hellhole that led me to all of this. I listed the house for sale and told the realtor that I would pay whatever needed paid. But I was never going back to that house again. It's only been a few days, and I know I have a lot to deal with now, but I have noticed some strange things happening. Call me crazy, but I could swear I could smell rotting flesh around my apartment. Anyways, I should wrap this up. My eyes have been getting really bloodshot recently, and I think it's best if I get out of the apartment. That story gave you chills, but the next one will freeze your blood. My son is addicted to Bobbles the Clown. I'm writing this now that it is a lover. It all started almost a year ago. I was watching the news. It was talking about how a child who murdered her family and killed herself. And this is only one of the many events like this that have been happening for a little while. After I watched it, I was thinking of what I should write, but I couldn't think of anything. After a few hours, I went to get some food when I went into the kitchen. Our kitchen is right next to the living room. I saw my son watching TV. I never saw him watching that show. So I asked him what he was watching. He said, "I'm watching Bobbles the Clown." I said, "Oh, then I eat my food." Nothing big happened for a few weeks, so now he was starting school again, so I told him to stop watching TV and get ready. Then he yelled at me, "I'm finishing the episode first, you bitch." I was pretty mad. It told him to get ready or he won't be allowed to watch TV for a week. He got ready after that. Over the next few weeks, his behavior got worse and worse. I decided to take him to a child psychiatrist, Doc. Jeff Jefferson. It took him there. He was pissed. They talked for an hour. In the meanwhile, I saw on the news a other child who murdered their parents and themselves. When they were done, Jefferson asked me if he was watching Bobbles the Clown. I replied yes, she said of course, and then said that he has a theory that Bobbles somehow connects to the children's bad behavior. He said most of the children had talks to watch that show. I have watched the first episode. I haven't noticed anything weird, but I still think something is wrong with it. I asked, well, can you just say to their parents for them to stop watching it? He replied, I've already tried, but they just go back to watching it. I said, weird, maybe we should watch a few episodes together. Later that day, I came to his house and we put on an episode. The intro was very childish, I thought. My son is way too old for this next thing. I know I fell asleep a few hours later. I woke up to see the T. Jefferson asleep. I woke him up and asked him what he saw. Then he said, I fell asleep right after the intro. I replied I did too. The next day Whit tried again, this time with coffee, but we both fell asleep before the intro finished. Weirded out. I posted on social media, has anyone seen more than one episode of Bobbles the Clown? Most people said no, and ones who said yes looked to be children. A few days later, Jefferson got a bunch of caffeine pills. We watched the show and took a pill every 30 seconds. We were able to make it past the first episode, but after the intro to the next episode, we fell asleep. Both of us didn't remember the episode, but Jefferson was keeping notes. His note said that the clown was breaking the fourth wall and was telling us to stop watching and to just stop doing anything with the show. We were about to talk about what to do next when all the caffeine pill gave us both heat attacks. They were pretty bad, so we called an ambulance and were taken to the hospital where we spent the rest of the night. We decided that we have to stop this madness, and we will go to the place where Bobbles the Clown was filmed. The next day we're searched. Bobbles the Clown, we found that the show is directed, written, produced, and starring Charlie Walker. We also found that Walker lives in San Francisco. We quickly booked out fight while I was packing. I was attacked by my son. He had a knife. He nearly stabbed me. I heard him coming, so I jumped out of the way. I quickly grabbed his arm and held him to the wall. Then I called Jefferson and asked him what to do. He said to just stay there. He arrived about 20 minutes later with a shot. I didn't know what was in it. My son quickly fell asleep, and then we tied him to his bed. In the morning, I hired a babysitter. I felt bad about her having to watch my son, and then we went to the airport and on the plane. Later, we arrived in San Francisco. We were able to find Walker's address, but it had a large wall and cameras, so we sat in our rental car until he left and went to the beach. We eventually walked up to him and said, hi, we're massive fans of Bobbles the Clown. Can we give you a quick interview? He looked quite confused, but said yes. We asked him why he does the show. He replied to help entertain children and make their life better. Right after he said that, Jefferson was pissed and yelled at him, talking about how he's making children kill their families and themselves. Then Walker replied saying he doesn't know what you're talking about and that he's done with the interview. His bodyguards watched us. While he left, the bodyguards looked lifeless. It told Jefferson, why did you do that? Then he said, Healy, we have to stop him. That night, we found the building that Bobbles the Clown was filmed in. We chose that tomorrow night we will break in. The next night came, and we were ready. We had some equipment, masks, and we both had a gun, just in case we broke through the bathroom window. We went in the hallway and found the workers still working. It was 11:41 p.m. We keep secretly going until we found Charlie Walker's office. We tried going in, but the door was locked. It told Jefferson to move out of the way, and I ran into the door and broke down and entered the office. In the was Walker dressed up in his clown costume. He pointed a pistol at us and asked what we're doing here. Jefferson told him to lower his gun, but the days expected. I said, we're here to stop you from killing any more people. Then Walker said, I know who you are. Noon knows you're in this building, so if I kill you and just clean up, Noon would ever know, right? While he said that, Jefferson quickly pulled out his gun and shot, but Walker also shot him, both of them now on the ground. I quickly went to Jefferson. He said to stop Walker. Meanwhile, Walker was getting up. I quickly shot him 3 times in the chest. He died almost immediately. I called an ambulance and then started searching for evidence. I found a form of sleep gas that if anyone over the age of 14 looks at, they would fall asleep. I also found scripts of the show. The ambulance and police arrived shortly, but it wasn't fast enough, Jefferson died, then issued the evidence, but I still had to go to court. After the show was canceled, my son's behavior went back to normal. Jefferson's name will always be remembered as responsible for saving thousands of lives. 1 year later, the court case was finally over. I wasn't found guilty, but you knew that being you are reading this, there is one more thing that the gas did disappear and Walker's wife is still alive. That was just the beginning. The next story is even more chilling. I landed at the wrong airport. For all intents and purposes, I'm not sure how to express my feelings about this experience. I initially thought that I'd keep this story to myself due to the fact that I didn't think people would believe it. And while that may certainly hold true despite me posting this is a story that needs to be told. By the title, you might assume that my experience wasn't abnormal in any way, or that it was at least incredibly frustrating or anxiety-inducing. But even then, how is it possible? How does a certified American Airlines pilot land their plane at the wrong airport and release their passengers like nothing was wrong? Was it even an error on their part, or was it an error on mine? And above all else, what could have compelled me to post this story to a place like this? To be honest, other than that last question, I don't know the answers to these questions, nor do I have any answers to the other mysteries that this story will bring up. What I can assure you of is that this was no normal landing, and this was no normal airport. It was about 3 days ago, and I was on a return flight from a business trip in New York. I live in Texas, so you could imagine that it would have been a decently long flight from JFK International to DFW. I'd been planning to go home and spend some time with my family, since the trip lasted a little longer than I thought it would. I guess in retrospect, I did fulfill these plans, but nothing could have overshadowed the events that transpired on that flight. I'd been, admittedly, scrambling to get a ticket for the return flight since I'm a bit of a procrastinator. In my luck, however, I was able to get an AA flight from NYC to Dallas, with only 7 seats left out of the 128 total seats on the plane. I got to the airport just fine, I went through customs just fine, and I made it to my gate just fine. By all accounts, this is as normal as a trek through JFK could go, save for my impeccable ability to lazily do everything at the last minute. Once they called my number, and I made my way onto the aircraft, everything proceeded out as normally as it could. I found my seat, stored my luggage, and sat comfortably until the plane took off without any abnormality. Once we were in the air, everything was, once again, just fine. The food was as bad as usual, the seats were as cramped as usual, and my headphones worked just fine as they usually do. The old lady that sat next to me didn't bother trying to talk to me, and spent the flight reading what looked like some sort of crappy romance novel. The reason I emphasize this is because by all means, this was a perfectly normal flight. There was no indication, no symptom that would have or could have predicted what transpired once we landed. Due to it being a long overnight flight, I fell asleep at around 11 a.m. I'm not a heavy sleeper when I'm on anything that isn't my own bed, so I figured I'd wake up a couple hours before we landed. When I came to, however, we were already descending to the airport. The plane stopped and stationed itself at the terminal. While somewhat off-topic now, I just wanted to preface by saying that I didn't really pay attention to the surrounding area outside my destination. I'd been on this flight several times beforehand, so I never bothered to get a good look at the outside of the airport. Getting off the plane was easy enough. Grabbed my luggage, waited for the people ahead to start moved towards the plane's exit. As I carried my fairly heavy bags into Terminal B, the jet lag starting to set upon me, I immediately noticed something strikingly obvious to anyone in the same mindset as I was. Airports aren't exactly known for being buildings with immense personalities. Many airports use very basic layouts and architecture, leading them to look and feel very similar to each other. However, if you travel often, you usually take note of the specific layouts and minor details that make the airport you're traveling from stand out at least a little bit from the rest around the country. They, at the very least, have some sort of iconography and trivia about the specific city or region they're located in. The more you travel around these places, the easier it is to remember certain things about them. This was the same case for me. The reason I state all this is because of the realization I made in that very moment when I stepped into that terminal. Every aspect of it, every minor detail of it, made it clear to me that this was not DFW. I stood there in confusion, wondering if my eyes were tricking me somehow. after around 10 seconds of contemplation, I came to the conclusion that I was correct. This wasn't DFW, nor was it any airport I'd ever been to in my life. In pure instinctive confusion, I started walking back towards the entrance to the plane, thinking that there was a wrong turn I could have made. I stopped myself, of course, realizing that trying to go back on a plane with the intention of staying on it for the next flight wouldn't be allowed in any way, shape, or form. Because of this, I tried to go for my second best option, finding the customer service desk at the gate for help. However, as I started to look around for it, not only could I not find any such desk existing, the second most perplexing thing I'd noticed so far came into view for me. There were no airport staff anywhere I could see. There were many people, for sure, but none of them had any sort of uniform, badge, or equipment that would make me think they worked for this place. So I tried asking the other people walking around. Even if this was completely unfamiliar to me, I could at least be comfortable knowing that I wasn't alone here, right? Well, soon enough, that sentiment proved to be useless here. "Hello?" I'd ask. "Please, I don't know where I am," I'd say. It all fell on deaf ears. Every person I tried asking just ignored me, walking on by as if my presence was completely invisible and inaudible. As I stood there and took on that information, I was rightfully weirded out by whatever predicament I'd gotten into. What was this place? What do I do now? While these questions entered my mind, time stood still in a way. Nothing felt real, as if I were somewhere that didn't really exist. With circulating feelings of perplexion, fear, and a slight sense of dread flowing in my brain, I could only stand there in awe of whatever new world I had ended up in, however mundane it seemed at first. Once I was able to move again, there was only one goal that clutched onto my thoughts, a survival instinct baked into the brain of every human being: escape. As I clenched my fists with bated breath, I walked forward into a new world I wasn't completely sure I could leave from. Despite my earlier grievances with the airport not being what I expected, the airport was relatively normal, on the surface at least. As I trekked throughout the terminal, passing by shops, walkways, gates, it all seemed like it was perfectly fine. Yet, in a way, that sort of mundane normality felt more uncanny than if it were distinctly strange and unnatural. I had never been to this place before, and as far as I knew, it didn't exist. I had absolutely no idea where I was or what I was doing here. Eventually, I reached a place I recognized, the entrance where I arrived. I'd fully circled the airport. Despite the fact that I'd loosely ascertained the layout of the airport, I realized that there were still no answers to my questions. While very stupid of me in retrospect, I only realized something important once this thought appeared in my head. My phone. I could look at my location on Google Maps and work my way from there. However, when I acted on this thought and pulled out my phone, it was to no avail. Every app I checked, every online service I tried, nothing would work right. But it wasn't just simply that every service was offline. No, it was just that nothing was working the way it should have. When I opened my phone, it turned on and worked just fine. But when I opened Google Maps to try and find my location, the map showed me nothing. Not that the map didn't load, but all it did was show me an empty, blank terrain. No roads, no towns, nothing. I went to my Messages app to see if I could text or call my parents and notify them of everything, to get any sign that I was still on the same planet as them. But when I attempted to text and call my parents, they never responded. Unread message after unread message. Missed call after missed call. I tried to do the same with my other contacts, my sister, my friends, my boss, etc. Still nothing. While I wasn't entirely sure of the specific time zone I was in, there had to be at least someone I knew that was awake to receive my messages. With this information, I came to the conclusion that not only could I not understand where I was, no one else did either. They hadn't received my messages, and I was completely, utterly alone. I had to lean against the wall and take in my situation. I really didn't know what to think of this, and in all fairness, I still don't. What's going on? How did I get here? These thoughts echoed in my mind, and I felt myself falling into a complete state of panic. However, something brought me out of it. Something I'd initially written off as ignorable, but one that suddenly filled me with curiosity. It was the people. I didn't really pay much attention to the people as I was traveling through the airport, since every time I tried to ask for help from them, they just ignored me. But as I adjusted my posture and started looking more closely at them, I figured out what it was that had garnered my focus. They were shiny. Not that they were glowing any sort of light, but instead the type of shininess that comes from light being reflected across a smooth surface, like say metal or glass. As I went to take a closer look, I realized that the reason this shiny reflectiveness was occurring was because their entire bodies were outlined with some sort of plastic sheen. It kind of looked like they were all completely wrapped in cellophane. For some reason, this was the first thing that made me truly terrified. I was panicked beforehand, for sure, but right then and there, I was taken by an overwhelming sense of dread, as I understood that the people I was surrounded with in this airport, the only human contact I had, weren't really human. Things only got worse from there. I started distancing myself from the people I was walking with, still keeping a close eye on them. But as I started wandering once more through this now foreboding structure, more unnerving things disturbed my psyche. The letters and numbers on the walls above stores and kiosks had started to change. At first, it looked like some of the letters had been switched around or removed, but as I kept walking, they became nearly unrecognizable gibberish. Some looked as though they'd been generated by a CAPTCHA in their unnatural positioning, while others couldn't even be distinguished as being letters in the English language. This continued on as I walked through the terminal, coming to understand that every piece of text in the airport had been transformed into incoherent scribbles. But while text changing on a wall only slightly confused and unnerved me, it was, once again, the people that freaked me out. As I still maintained a relatively safe distance, I noticed how the strange plastic texture of their skin had started to transform. I warped from a sort of cellophane wrap to a hard shell plastic, like their entire skin tissue had been replaced by the material of a mannequin. More things started to confirm this observation, as it appeared that their external features, eyes, clothes, shoes, etc., had started to flatten into this hard shell, eventually reaching a point where their entire body looked as though someone had painted an incredibly realistic drawing of a human onto a store mannequin. The only saving grace I had in this place was the small hope that, despite their ghastly forms, they weren't going to hurt me. Though unnerved and frustrated by it before, I'd now come to appreciate the fact that they were set on never acknowledging my existence. While I didn't want to startle them, and still kept a multi-foot distance from them, I still felt hopeful in the fact that we're content on ignoring my presence. That hope wouldn't last. I kept walking and walking, wondering if I could even find some sort of exit. I must have circled the terminal around 10 times, with no food or drink to sustain me. I finally sat down, still reeling from the dynamic fear, frustration, and confusion that had manifested in me due to this place. I had to sit with myself for a while, mumbling to myself those same questions from earlier. What's going on? How did I get here? Along with some new ones. What are those things? How do I get out of this? Finally, in a scream, mixed with frustration, fear, and confusion, as the emotions swelling inside me finally reached their boiling point, I yelled out, "Where the hell do I go?" Almost as soon as I asked it, though, the airport answered. But it wasn't the answer I wanted. When I was a kid, I had a near-death experience at a pool. At least that's how I saw it at the time. Since I couldn't swim very well, I went under the surface of the water in a deep part of the pool, where I felt myself starting to drown as I struggled to return above. In reality, I was likely in no considerable danger, since I was barely 2 feet underwater, and my mom was able to pull me to the surface with little struggle. But to me, I felt the overwhelming fear and anticipation of death as the water seemed to pull me farther down to my demise, while the light of the surface drew further from my vision. I felt like I was going to die, and that scared me to no end. As you could imagine, even as life has gone on into adulthood, I've only felt that fear of death once at that pool. That was until this moment, as I stared at the newest and by far the worst disturbance the airport had presented me. In the middle of the walkway, standing around 20 feet away from me, was another one of those plastic, human things. but it wasn't walking around like the rest of them were. It was hunched over, shuddering, in some sort of shock, as if it were injured. As I looked closer, though, I understood why. Its body was splattered with blood and viscera, which originated from several wounds placed all across its head and torso. Like the rest of its features, it looked like it was painted on its hard shell, mannequin body. However, it still reacted as though it was hurt. Another odd difference I noticed, though, was the way its skin and clothes looked on its body. Unlike the others, its red and black plaid shirt, blue jeans, and white skin looked less realistic than the others. While every other airport denizen I'd seen looked like it had a photo scan of human features pasted on a mannequin shell, the injured one had a more rushed, unfinished look, with it looking similar to a simplistic portrait with no harsh shadows or clear outlines. Yet the worst thing about it by far was the direction it was looking in. Mine. While the others had continued ignoring me, this one broke the tradition and was clearly directing its attention towards me, shuddering and groveling as it awaited for my reply. At this point, I didn't know what to believe anymore. I had been in this place for what felt like hours, and I didn't see any way out of this situation, no matter how much I wanted to stay away from that thing. It didn't walk or run towards me at any point, it just kept staring at me. The airport started to fall more quiet as well. The ambient noise of rolling suitcases across marble floors and the echoes of conversation between people dimmed as my focus continued to fall on the creature ahead of me. However, despite my absolute reluctance, I decided to approach it. You guys may lambaste me for this decision, which is fair, but I had run out of options. As I slowly moved towards, still wary of provoking it, I said, "Hello, what do you want?" No response. "Please, I just want to leave. I don't have any problem with you." It still didn't say anything. Eventually, I got close enough to where I was standing right in front of it. It still didn't say or do anything, just trembling as a result of a nondescript wound. Right before I left out of confusion, I heard something coming from its direction. It was hard to notice at first, but as I looked closer, I realized it was a barely audible, hushed whisper. I leaned in closer, hoping to discern what it was saying. It sounded like gibberish, the kind of nonsensical monologue expected of an asylum patient, except this one's mouth wasn't moving. Then, all of a sudden, louder than before in a hushed, raspy tone, it said one discernible word: evil. Before I could even process what it said, a loud bang went off next to my ear. I recoiled from the sound, covering my right ear with my hand as it started ringing. I writhed on the ground for a second until I looked up to see what the source of the noise was. There was nothing. No person, no object, no firearm like I assumed it was. Nothing was there. I felt blood trickling down the side of my head. Panicking at the thought that I was the target of that sound, I checked every part of my head until I realized that the blood was coming from my ear. The noise was so powerful that it blew out my eardrum, leaving it so my head was ringing even after the sound had stopped. Despite being dazed by the sudden injury, I was still lucid enough to question where that shot had landed and why it had been shot. However, it didn't take me long to find out my answer. Only about 2 feet away from me was the injured creature from before, laying in an ever-growing pool of blood. The blood wasn't just plastered across its mannequin shell body. It was actually physically manifesting. I staggered back in horror, taking in the revolting scene in front of me, before regaining my senses and examining it more closely. Part of me wishes I hadn't. The source of the blood was a large hole on the side of its head, and it looked cracked, kind of like an eggshell. Underneath the shell revealed a solid mass of flesh, blood, and other viscera, slightly concave due to the impact of the weapon. The body, originally twitching and shuddering at any interference, is now laid lifeless as its pain was ended by an unknown assailant. I'm pretty sure it was a gun. I landed at the wrong airport part 2. For who knows how long, I stared blankly into nothingness as my brain was starting to rationalize what had just happened. I'm still not sure I have. Whatever it was that occurred in front of me, it only further fueled my desire to leave this place and never think about it again. Luckily, a sliver of hope finally found its way towards me. While I was staring blankly, on my hands and knees and on the verge of hyperventilating, a thought came into my mind. I say came into, because it was so shocking that I couldn't have possibly forgotten it beforehand. So much so that I believe it couldn't have possibly come from my subconscious brain. I got up from the ground and rushed over to a list of flights on an electronic board. All of them were unreadable lettering like before, all except for one, clear as day, written on the board, was a flight listed for DFW International Airport. I had been on a layover flight. I wasn't supposed to try and exit the airport, but was instead supposed to wait until this next flight came to take me to my actual destination. Although now I can berate myself for not remembering this important detail, at the moment I had no time to worry about that. The time for takeoff, written on the board, was 3:30. I checked my phone for the current time. It was 2:30. Though I wasn't thrilled at the fact I'd have to spend another hour there, I at least had something to hold on to for hope. I rushed over to the gate listed for the flight and saw that there were no other people sitting near it. When I first arrived at the gate, I noticed the plane connected to the PBB outside the window. I still had my suspicions about my sudden layover flight theory, so it was reassuring to see the plane where it was supposed to be. While I was looking at the plane, however, it dawned on me that this was the first time I was paying attention to what was happening outside the airport. And after I peered out the window more, I realized why. Unlike the liminal hellscape found within the airport, the surrounding exterior landscape looked completely normal. Although I didn't see any people out there, it was peaceful and benign. I saw vehicles moving around, birds flying around the area, and even a plane taking off at some point. The area outside the airport premises seemed normal as well, looking a lot like the terrain I saw in East Texas, near the DFW area. Although it was a nice distraction from the current situation, reality soon weighed down upon me as I recognized that no matter how much I wanted to go out there and be free of this place, the airport terminal wouldn't let me leave. As a contrast to the surreal normality of the outside, I looked back into the disturbing interior of the inside, only to notice just how more decrepit it had become. The text on the walls had deteriorated to the point where you wouldn't be blamed for thinking it was some sort of abstract art. It started almost melting into the floor, with little streaks of black and white ooze stretched into little pools on the floor. The architecture of the building itself didn't fare much better. Parts of the building started glitching in and out of existence, almost like static you'd see on an old TV. It got to the point where one of the hanging light fixtures on the ceiling fell in the middle of the main walkway, almost crushing a group of the creatures walking through. Though it didn't hit any of them, I still wonder what their reaction would have been. The people also started looking worse to me, though I wasn't sure if they had actually changed at all, or if my perception of them had gotten worse after the previous incident. At this point, what little curiosity I had about this place had completely run dry, and I wanted nothing to do with the people I shared this space with. Like before, they kept walking as if nothing was there, not even acknowledging the body of one of their own people laying in the middle of the walkway. I even saw one resembling a child step on it, like it was just part of the ground they walked on. I didn't want to pay attention any further, though. I just grabbed my phone, listened to some downloaded music, and sat at the gate waiting for the flight. I tried tending my ear with some paper towels and emergency first aid equipment I brought along with me for the trip, and while it still hurt like hell, I managed to stop the bleeding. I shut out every other source of interest and just focused on the task at hand. That was, of course, until I saw one staring at me. I tried my best to ignore them, I really did, but I couldn't do it for long. Even though it felt like hours since I last looked at the time, I needed to be focused on leaving this place, not interacting with it. However, the urge to look one over, maybe out of fear, confusion, or even a little bit of curiosity. Whatever the case, I'm still not sure if I'm glad that I saw it. Most of the creatures were walking around as before, but one stood out. It was walking along the main pathway the same way as all the others, but it was looking straight at me. As it walked along the terminal path, it locked its gaze on me, even twisting its head around like an owl in order to not break it. Once it disappeared from my sight, I started panicking once again. I stood up and walked back towards the wall, on the verge of hyperventilating. That's when my ear started ringing again. Although my ear was in bad condition beforehand, I managed to clean it up and make the ringing stop. While it stopped hurting as bad, and I could listen to myself think, I also figured out that I was practically deaf in my right ear. Any sound coming from that direction was muffled and directionless. That's the only way I know how to put it. The only exception to that was the ringing that played in my head just then. Either spurred by my panic attack or some other force that I didn't recognize, my ear started ringing even louder than before. It wasn't long before I lost my balance from the noise and fell down on my right knee. When I tried coordinating myself while holding my hand against my pulsating right ear, I looked ahead to reassess the danger in front of me, only to see what I was most dreading to see. There were more of them looking at me now, but this time they weren't moving. They stood not far from the main walkway, completely stationary. All of them looked even more disheveled than before. Their hard shells, previously adorned with photorealistic art, now showed obvious mistakes and imperfections. Unlike the curated lookalikes from before, these were the farthest thing from humans I had seen so far, and they were standing 20 feet away from me. With slight struggle, I regained my balance and was able to fully stand up. My ear was still ringing, but I didn't care as much considering what I was seeing. I was terrified of taking my eyes off them. I wanted to check my phone, check and see what time it was, and how fast I could get on the plane. Could I even get on the plane? My mind started to race with these anxieties, but still not daring to break my gaze on them. Like a Western standoff, I looked for any sign of movement from them, hoping to react to any action they may take. But they didn't do anything. They just stood there and stared at me. My anxiety, my stress, my instinct to run continued to build up, but I couldn't move. All I could do was look at them. Eventually, though, I couldn't take it anymore. In my panic and my desire to end the stasis between me and them, I say, "Please, I just want to leave. I'm trying to go. I'm sorry." For a moment, they didn't do anything, just kept staring. Until, however, one of them started casually walking towards me from the left side of the gate. Then another from the right side. Then another, and another, until all 5 of them started making their way towards me. My instincts and fear kicked into overdrive. I started kiting them around seats at the gate, trying to keep a good distance between them. They kept pursuing me, but never picked up their pace or tried to rush me down. They just kept walking towards me nonchalantly. It all looked so robotic. The fakers did everything like it was a routine task, never acting like I was a serious threat. But they still kept coming for me. For what reason, I didn't want to know. While I continued to avoid them, I tried leveraging my options. Although I wanted to run away from the gate, I couldn't risk going into the crowd walking along the terminal. They were ignoring what was happening at the gate, but I wasn't willing to go anywhere near them. I could try and go for the door to the plane, but I knew that the time for the flight hadn't arrived yet, and that if the door was locked, I would be completely cornered. My breath started to run dry, and my stamina of keeping away these things began to drain. I yelled out to them, "Please, God, please stop. What do you want?" They didn't respond. They just kept walking at me, the only barricade being the seats that only line just above my waist. I stopped for a moment, trying to catch my breath that was lost from physical strain and major panic, as 4 of them were close to cornering me. Before they got to me, though, I jumped over the seats and moved to the other side of the gate, leaving a barrier and a considerable amount of room between us. For whatever reason, that filled me with immense confidence. Confidence that I'd be able to ward off the creatures long enough for me to get on the flight. Confidence that I could leave this hellhole and see my family. Confidence that, within seconds, was washed away completely as I felt something touch my right arm. I slowly turned my head to see what it was, and I could have sworn my heart stopped for a second. One of them was holding my arm. The one split off from the rest of them. When my body unfroze from terror, I tried pulling my arm away, but it was no use. It had an iron grip on my arm. It barely even flinched when I tried breaking free. Even worse, somehow, was how cold its hand was. It felt like ice pressing into my skin. holding me in place as it stared blankly into my eyes. It just held me in place for around 30 seconds as I tried my hardest to pull away from it, until it raised its other hand. It slowly moved its hand towards my upper forearm and grabbed it tight like the other hand was. Then, I kid you not, in one swift downward motion, it broke my fucking arm. I screamed out in pain, the snap of my bone rippling throughout the rest of my body. Emotions flooded my brain as the shock from the pain started taking hold of me. Then I noticed its hand moving up further to my upper arm. In my panic, I tried pulling it away from them before realizing both how much my arm hurt to move and how immobile it was when I did. In a last-ditch effort to get it away, I started kicking at its stomach, since I was close enough to reach it. It felt like I was kicking a brick wall, but I could tell that it was flinching more than before. Finally, through the rage and adrenaline that was pumping through my veins, I kicked it hard enough to loosen its grip before it tried breaking my arm in another place. Then, with another swift kick to the creature's abdomen, it lost its balance, let go of my arm, and toppled to the floor. Even through the pain and exhaustion, I could hear something shatter. I looked down and saw the thing that attacked me lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling from its head. When I kicked it down, it seemed like it hit its head on the side of one of the chairs, cracking its head open similar to the other one I saw before. I think seeing it dead on the floor drove me out of my adrenaline-fueled state and quickly spun around to check my surroundings. Surprisingly, I didn't see any creatures making their way towards me. Instead, they were all frozen. They were all posed as if they were walking, but they were completely still like a statue. But then I looked past them, back at the area where the others were walking, only to see that they too were frozen. And just like how some were looking at me from before, they were all looking at the body. I didn't bother checking the time. I slowly walked to the door to the plane, hoping I could escape without angering them. They continued to remain still, just looking at the mess I'd made of one of their own. I had no idea what they wanted to do with me before, but I certainly didn't want to know what they wanted now. I slowly crept my way to the door, still keeping a close eye on any sudden movements from the creatures. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw one turn its head. While I'm not sure if it truly did or not, I panicked nonetheless. I broke into a sprint towards the door, making it there in seconds before trying the knob. To my horror, the door was locked. I quickly looked out the window to see if the plane was there, saw that it was still there, and without thinking, started banging my body against the door. My left shoulder started to ache as I pushed into the door, my body wincing at every slight movement of my right arm. This was the only thing keeping me from leaving, and I wouldn't let it best me. I yelled, "Come on, Simon," every time my body impacted the door, until I could see the door just slightly holding on to the lock. Before I delivered the final push, however, I heard a collective rumbling behind me. When I looked to see what it was, I could see the people profusely vibrating, creating a hollow chattering noise echo across the room. Suddenly, a shrill scream erupted in the middle of the crowd from the terminal walkway, a scream that was then reciprocated by every creature in the room. After about a second of this, the horde descended upon me, frantically running towards me like zombies. Before they could reach me, I quickly busted through the door and bolted away. I rushed through the corridor, desperate to keep up speed as I heard a cacophony of footsteps and screams echoing behind me. I eventually made it to the passenger bridge connecting the plane to the airport, so close to salvation. But my sprint towards the door was cut short due to a sudden rumbling beneath my feet, causing me to fall to the ground on my broken arm. They had made it here too. As I tried standing back up, I briefly looked back to see where they were, only to let out a cry of fear when I saw what they had become. They had lost all pretense of being human, and had formed a mass of fleshy plastic bodies as they pushed forward through the corridor. They were pushing against each other, blocking each other's passage as they scrambled to reach me. The narrow passageway was enough to slow them down, but the constant thudding and pushing was causing the passenger bridge to shake and shudder. And, with already enough reason to walk faster, I realized that their combined weight would eventually cause the bridge to collapse. spilling us all out onto the concrete runway. I got up as fast as I could, still holding on to a nearly functionless arm as I finally made it to the plane. The door to the plane was thankfully open for me to board, so I rushed in and caught my breath. Then, I turned back to see if I could close the door, only to realize it was blocked by the passenger bridge being connected. I stood there in horror, knowing that the horde was about to board the plane with me and corner me against the back of the plane. I had nowhere to run. Suddenly, the horde turned the corner near the plane entrance and continued clamoring towards me. Then, in a moment of supreme luck or divine intervention, a half-second before they reached me, the passenger bridge collapsed under their weight, scraping the side of the plane as it went down. Not bothering to see the aftermath, I reached out the side of the plane and slammed the door. It was over. I stood there, holding the handle tight as my body ached and shivered. Then, not long after, I vomited on the floor. I broke down, crying and yelling as the weight of what happened rushed through me. If I was any slower than them, even by a second, I could have died. Even worse, they could have dragged me back in, doing whatever God knows what to me and leaving me stranded there forever. I laid on the floor and let all the pain, fear, and sadness wash over before I stood up again to examine where I was. The plane was empty, no staff, no passengers in sight, just rows upon rows of empty seats. For a little while, this was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, I was finally free from the monsters that had plagued me for the last couple hours. But on the other hand, there was no one here to help me leave this place. I checked every area of the plane, even the cockpit, to see if anyone was there to help me get in the air. But there was no one there. I started to lose all hope for my escape, thinking that my layover flight theory was possibly nothing more than another source of torment borne by the airport. Before I fully succumbed to despair, I felt the ground moving beneath my feet. Still reeling from my last encounter, I frantically looked back and forth across the plane to see if the horde had managed to follow me onto the aircraft. But the reason for the sudden movement was much simpler than that. I looked out the window to see that the plane was rolling across the tarmac, despite the lack of a pilot. I moved to check the cockpit again, but was stopped by a voice suddenly blaring over the intercom. There was a jarring, but at this point, welcome sense of normalcy in the voice of, presumably, the pilot. It was what he had said that confused me. Even through my injured, confused, anxiety-ridden, and distraught state, I could hear him say, "Thank you for joining us on American Airlines Flight 1115. We're happy to have you. We're getting ready to take off in about 10 minutes, so we recommend you take your seats, buckle your seatbelts, and tighten the strap as close to your waist as you can. Thank you for being patient with us, and we hope you enjoyed your time at Eden Central Airport. We hope you can travel through us again soon." Eden. I'd never heard of an airport named Eden Central Airport before, and yet, apparently, that was the one I went through. The strangest thing about it, though, was that it wasn't the first time I had heard the word Eden when traveling through the airport, but I hadn't realized it at the time. In fact, it's only now while writing this that I made the connection between the message over the intercom and the encounter I had with the injured creature only hours beforehand. There's still so many questions I have about what happened, and I don't really know if I want the answers. But there was really only one thought on my mind after I heard the message. I need to sit down. I followed the pilot's directions. I took my seat, buckled my seatbelt, and tightened the strap to my waist. It was a bit of a struggle, considering only one of my arms worked, but I eventually did it. When I sat down, I checked to see how my arm was doing, only to find that it was bright red, and that there was intense swelling around my upper forearm. It was then that I realized that I had no idea what I was going to tell people when I got out of all this. I couldn't tell them the truth. It was too bizarre, and I had no actual evidence. I would either be labeled as a liar or schizophrenic, but then, what would I tell them instead? I sat there, pondering these questions while the plane started picking up speed and making its way to the runway. I think the adrenaline from my escape finally wore off then, because I could really feel the aching pain of my arm and my ear again. The pain and exhaustion from my experience had finally caught up to me, and as I sat there reflecting over everything that happened to me, the plane sped across the runway to eventually achieve flight. And as I felt the ground below me breaking contact with the surface of the earth, I passed out. I don't know how long I slept after that, but when I woke up, I felt a lot better than before. I looked out one of the plane windows to see we were descending towards what looked like DFW. I had to be sure this time. I peered out the window to get a better view of the environment until something tapped me on the shoulder. I whirled around in horror, expecting to see that one of those things had gotten on the flight with me, but instead I saw something even more shocking. There was a little old lady sitting in the seat next to me who asked if I could help her find one of her hearing aids that she dropped on the floor. The same old lady who sat next to me on my last flight. Hiding my shock, I quickly said yes, bent down, and found it sitting next to my shoe. I handed it to her, and she thanked me, then went back to reading her trashy romance novel. I looked back at the window for a few seconds, hoping to see something out of the ordinary, before I realized what I just did. I quickly looked at my right arm, only to see that the swelling and aching was gone, and that I could move it perfectly freely. I also realized that despite having my eardrum blown out, I could hear what the old lady said just fine. I rubbed the right side of my head to see if there was still any semblance of blood, but there was none. It was like my injuries healed completely in my sleep, but I knew that that couldn't be possible, even in normal circumstances. By all accounts, everything returned to how it was before. We eventually landed down in DFW, and people started getting out of their seats and grabbing their luggage. I was hesitant to leave my seat, but I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Eventually, I got up and looked at the cabin above only to realize that in my rush and my struggle to leave the terminal, I forgot my luggage. I couldn't believe how stupid I was, even if I was in a life or death scenario. I decided to open the bin to hopefully see if I missed one of my bags the first time around, only to discover that all of my luggage was there, exactly where I left it on the first flight. It occurred to me that, despite all logic, I was on the first flight. I reeled from this, just staring at my luggage before being hurriedly told to hurry up by an irritated passenger behind me. I apologized, grabbed my things, and moved towards the plane's exit. I walked through the corridor with the other passengers, dreading what could be at the end when we reached the terminal. When we finally made it there, I was relieved to see that this wasn't some unfamiliar terminal like before, but instead the one I was supposed to expect, DFW. I looked around and saw that there were people, not things pretending to be people, actual people talking to each other, casually living their lives. Despite the mundanity of it all, it was something I was happy to see. I walked through the familiar terminal and exited with no issue. I walked down to baggage claim to get my extra luggage, and then went out the door to the outside world. I was visited by a gray, cloudy sky, a long line of cars resting on the sidewalk, and my parents waiting by their car to see me. I paused for a moment before I went, and I considered opening up to them about what I went through. But how could I do that? Nothing that happened would make any sense to them, and I doubt they would fully believe me. Although it ate away at me, I decided not to tell them. I went over to them, and they welcomed me with open arms and wide smiles. Before long, though, my mom asked if something was wrong, and that I seemed shaken up about something. I told her that I was fine, and just jet-lagged. Knowing them, I'm not sure if they believe me. It's been a couple of days since then, and they still don't know what happened. And if I'm being honest, I don't either. I have always been a logical person, and have tried to look through most things with scientific explanation as opposed to faith or creative imagination. This time, I can't do that. It was too real to be a dream, but too bizarre to be reality. I don't know. Maybe putting this story here will help. Maybe it'll plague my mind even more than it did before. Nothing feels right anymore. I don't think I'm going to fly again for a while.